the satisfying downfall of every major dictator. When you talk about some of the most evil dictators in all of modern history, most people reasonably focus on their crimes against humanity. However, people typically forget to mention exactly how these people were brought to justice or how they got away with it. And in this video, we're going to discuss exactly how every major dictator lost either their power or, in most cases, their life. Let's begin. Kim Jong-il. In 1994, Kim Jong-il became the ruler of North Korea when his father passed away. And what Kim Jong-il inherited from his father was a communist nation that was run with an iron fist, completely isolated from any outside sources, repressive in almost every sense of the word, and riddled with human rights violations. And Kim Jong-il gladly took this country and continued the tradition. And like any wild dictator, of course, he gave himself a crazy title. In this case, Kim Jong-il was the supreme leader of North Korea. Due to how secretive North Korea is, there's actually not much known about Kim Jong-il's early life, although it's speculated that he was born in 1941 on a Soviet military base near the Russia-North Korean border because that's where his father was stationed at the time. However, when Kim Jong-il became the supreme leader of North Korea, a lot of interesting facts were presented by the North Korean government about their new leader's past. Specifically, that he was born on February 16th, 1942 on top of North Korea's sacred Mount Pictu. But not only that he was born on top of this mountain, but when he was born, a new star appeared in the sky and a double rainbow appeared overhead. That claim alone is crazy, and keep in mind, this isn't hyperbole or metaphorical. They present this information as fact, and the North Korean citizens are meant to believe it. And even if they don't believe it, they better act like they believe it. But besides the crazy claims about his birth, there's also an endless supply of crazy claims around his achievements in his life. One of my favorites being that he made 11 holes in one in a single round of golf. Another being that he composed operas popular in China, and also that he invented an invisible cell phone and that he could literally control the weather. I feel bad for the North Korean citizens that blindly fell for all of this obvious propaganda, but I almost feel worse for those who saw through the propaganda and had to believe in a world that they knew was fake and there was nothing they could do about it. At least if you believed it, you were blissfully ignorant to the truth. Regardless, after Kim Jong-il grew to power, only a few years after Kim Jong-il was given power of all of North Korea, he was responsible for a series of famines that killed an estimated 2 million people from 1994 until 2000. And that is really only the beginning of the human rights violations that happened in North Korea during his supreme rule. But things started to change in the late 2000s, when Kim Jong-il was not seen in public places, specifically in the 2008 Olympics or in military demonstrations where he was always attending. Other countries started to suspect that Kim Jong-il was beginning to be in poor health or potentially even already dead, although the North Korean state media made it seem like everything was just fine and dandy. That was until December 17th, 2011, when Kim Jong-il was confirmed dead by the North Korean government. The North Korean government claimed that he died of overexertion because he was simply working so hard, making North Korea the best it could be for the people. But in reality, he likely just passed away from a heart attack. And following his death, there was a mandatory 11-day mourning period where everybody had to publicly look upset about the death. And Kim Jong-il's body was even placed on public display in a memorial palace in Pyongyang. This is the same palace where his father's body is also on permanent display. Following his death, his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, was given total control of this dictatorial regime. And as of today, he's still in power. But maybe in a future video, we can discuss his downfall as well. Hideki Tojo. Hideki was born and raised deep within the grips of imperialistic Japan. He was born in 1884 and began his education at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, and then began his career in the Imperial Japanese Army in 1905. After spending time in the Japanese Army, he served as the military attaché in Germany, of all places, from 1919 until 1922. And from that point, over the next 15 to 20 years, he began quickly rising through the ranks of the Japanese military and Japanese government until October of 1941, when he was appointed the Prime Minister of Japan. Now, under a different context, that may seem like an impressive military and political career. However, the actions that took place under this man's rule is anything but impressive, and is truly nothing short of a nightmare. Hideki was the Prime Minister of Japan from 1941 until 1944 when, well, we'll get to that. And if you couldn't already tell, that was during the Second World War. And if you know anything about World War II in Japan, well, they weren't up to much good stuff. And some of the things attributed to Hideki's rule are the following. Numerous war crimes, including the massacre and starvation of thousands of of prisoners of war and millions of innocent civilians, the attack that happened on Pearl Harbor, which literally happened 2 months after he was appointed prime minister, and other numerous mass murders that happened in and out of Japan during his rule. And not to mention, before he was even prime minister but still an extremely highly ranking military official, the whole Japanese invasion of China in 1937 happened, and that's a completely different can of worms, but just know that that was literally hell on earth as well. It's safe to say that a genocidal, military appointed prime minister is really nothing short of a dictator. And even if you don't specifically classify him as a dictator, well, his resume doesn't make him any better than one. And on July 18th of 1944, Hideki actually resigned as prime minister, as the war was definitely not going Japan's way. After he resigned, Japan surrendered to the Allied powers, and in September of 1945, Hideki was arrested. Following his arrest, he was put on trials in an international tribunal military court, where he was sentenced to death for numerous crimes against humanity and numerous war crimes. And on December 23rd, 1948, only 2 days before Christmas, Hideki was hung. And his reign of terror was over, but definitely not forgotten. Pol Pot. In the 1960s, in the Cambodian jungle, Pol Pot began to organize the Khmer Rouge, a group that advocated for a radical communist revolution to essentially wipe out any form of Western influence in Cambodia. In 1970, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge troops, along with North Vietnamese troops, began a large-scale insurgency against the Cambodian government. And through this insurgency, they were able to control a third of the entire country. And by April of 1975, only 5 years later, Khmer Rouge was able to capture the capital of Cambodia, overthrow the pro-US regime, and establish a new government, the Kampuchean People's Republic. Once Pol Pot was fully in power of Cambodia, the cities were evacuated, schools and factories were closed, and any form of private property or currency was abolished. And terrifyingly, anybody who is believed to be intellectual, such as somebody who was proficient in math or potentially spoke a foreign language, was immediately killed. Even if you were good at your job, just a skilled worker, you were also killed. But even if you weren't speaking other languages or particularly good at your job, if you even had any form of basic technology, such as glasses, a watch, or even maybe a little radio, you were once again killed. And because of this, from 1975 to 1978, it's estimated that over 2 million Cambodian people were killed by either execution or forced labor or famine. But in 1978 to 1979, Vietnamese troops were back in Cambodia, but this time to overthrow the Khmer Rouge because they saw how crazy things have gotten. And in 1979, Pol Pot and the remaining Khmer Rouge members retreated back into the Cambodian jungle. In 1985, Pol Pot officially retired from being the head of the Khmer Rouge, even though it was already at this point no longer controlling Cambodia and more or less of a entity that just existed in Cambodia. But even still, after his retirement, the Khmer Rouge still continued to take out guerrilla actions against the Cambodian government. But in 1997, Pol Pot was finally put on trial, and he was sentenced not to death, but to life in prison. And if you're not already upset, this is where things get really upsetting. Because although so many people wanted him to be extradited and sentenced to death, he not only just got life in prison, but he was also able to serve time in his home on house arrest. And a year after his trial in 1998, Pol Pot declared in an interview that, quote, "My conscience is clear." And later that year, he died in his home peacefully in his sleep. Life is truly unfair. Some of the best people in the world are gone too soon in horrific ways. And others who kill millions of their own people get to live long lives and die peacefully in their sleep. Sometimes you just feel like justice truly wasn't served. Benito Mussolini. World War II is going to be a common theme in this video because unfortunately there was an abundance of dictators, but I'm going to sprinkle them throughout so it's not all at once. Early in Mussolini's career, he was a socialist politician and a journalist at a newspaper. And in 1912, he became a member of the National Directorate of the Italian Socialist Party, but was actually kicked out of that because he wanted military intervention in World War I. Because of this, in 1914, Mussolini founded his own newspaper and also served in the Royal Italian Army until he was wounded and discharged in 1917. After being removed from both political and military groups, he decided that the best next course of action was to start his own thing. And what he started was a fascist movement in Italy. In 1922, following the March on Rome, he was appointed as the prime minister by King Victor Emmanuel III. And shortly after becoming the non-elected prime minister of a country, Mussolini, through the help of his secret police and his followers, were able to consolidate all of their power, transforming Italy into a one-party dictatorship. Within 5 years of being the appointed prime minister, Mussolini was able to establish a dictatorial authority by both illegal and legal means. And his goal was to create a totalitarian state. And if you're unfamiliar, totalitarianism is essentially just a political system that literally prohibits the opposition of the government, meaning that the government controls and owns everything and you cannot say anything about it. From his rise to power in 1922 to 1937, there was multiple wars and conflicts that Italy was involved in due to their new political structure. And in 1937, after the huge costs of all of the conflicts that they were involved in, they decided to preemptively join the Axis powers, specifically Germany and Japan. And this ended up being extremely helpful for Italy because they were completely unprepared for World War War II. In July of 1943, when the Allied powers invaded Sicily, King Victor Emmanuel III, the person who initially appointed Mussolini, was now dethroning Mussolini, and didn't only take his power, but also put him in custody. But it didn't last long, as Germany was able to successfully rescue Mussolini, and Mustache Man from Germany made Mussolini a ruler of a not-so-official puppet state that was just a German-occupied part of northern Italy, which was known as the Italian Social Republic. But when Germany and Italy and the Axis powers began to fall, and it was obvious that the Axis powers were no longer going to win World War II, Mussolini and his mistress at the time attempted to fully flee Italy and go to Switzerland to essentially go into hiding. While en route to Switzerland, the pair stopped near Lake Como with a group of other fascists and German soldiers, basically right on the border of Switzerland. During this brief break on their escape, Mussolini was actually trying to be incognito, and how he did so was by dressing up as a German soldier, which you know you're a bad guy if you're disguised as a German soldier. But even with this disguise, it didn't help him, because Italian partisans saw him and killed him and his girlfriend essentially on sight. They recognized him, and at that point, Mussolini no longer existed. Nicolae Ceausescu. Born in 1918, Nicolae was born to be a politician. As a child, he was a member of the Romanian Communist Youth Movement, and as a young adult, he found himself rising through the ranks of the Romanian Communist Party. And when the previous leader of that communist government died in 1965, Nicolae was handed the torch, and he became the Romanian Communist Party General Secretary. And from being declared General Secretary in 1965, he was able to gain power, and in 1974, only 9 years later, declare himself as the Romanian president, which essentially gave him total control of the entire country of Romania. When somebody grants themselves total control of an entire country, it's not hard to believe that they would start easing in things like censorship of the press and totalitarian rule, something we discussed earlier. And it got so bad that at the time it was considered one of the most repressive governments in all of Europe. Nicolae had secret police that were responsible for mass surveillance and even mass repression of human rights abuses that were happening in the country. And because of his censorship of the press, a lot of the things that were going on within the country were not able to be spread within or outside of the country either. There was a time when Nicolae was actually popular, although his popularity was extremely brief and unstable. And during the late 1970s, while he was the president, his mismanagement led to massive debts for the country of Romania. And in 1982, Nicolae forced the Romanian government to export way too much of the country's agricultural resources in order to help pay these debts, which obviously put pressure on the citizens of Romania. Fast forward to 1989, only 7 years later, anti-government protesters are popping up all over the place. And Nicolae saw these demonstrations as a political threat and ordered the military to open fire on these demonstrators, resulting in multiple deaths and injuries. And because of this action, the people could no longer take it, and massive, widespread rioting and civil unrest roared across the entire country of Romania and sparked the Romanian Revolution. It got to the point where demonstrators were breaking into the Capitol building of Romania, and Nicolae and his wife fled from the roof of the building on a helicopter, although the military forced them to land, and they were arrested, tried, and convicted of economic sabotage and genocide. And the couple were sentenced to death immediately, and both Nicolae and his wife were executed via a firing squad on Christmas Day, 1989. Joseph Stalin. Stalin was born to a poor Georgian family in the Russian Empire, and as a young adult joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, while at the same time he was also helping raise funds for Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction, and how he was donating to this faction was actually by committing bank robberies and other crimes, as well as editing the party's newspaper. Already off to a good start. Because of his crimes, he was repeatedly arrested, where he was exiled to Serbia multiple times. After the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, Stalin served as a member of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Very quick and easy name. And from 1922 onward, he used his position as General Secretary to gain control over the entire party. After Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, Stalin was the new man in charge. And Stalin's doctrine of socialism in one country became central to the party's ideology. And while he was now in power and had grand plans for the Soviet Union, it didn't really work out in his favor, because due to his poor policies, natural disasters, increased demand for food because of urbanization caused by his poor policy, a nationwide famine took place from 1932 till 1933 and killed millions of people in the Soviet Union. But that's not all. Only 3 years later, between 1936 and 1938, Stalin executed hundreds of thousands of confirmed and potential political opponents in what was called the Great Purge. And on top of that, under his regime, an estimated 18 million people were processed through the Gulag system of forced labor camps, which was essentially hell on earth. Keep in mind, all of this took place after after World War I and before World War II. Of course, then World War II happens, which is an entirely separate can of worms, which is beyond the scope of this video at this point. But to put it in short, after World War II, the dust had settled and people were happy that, you know, the Axis powers were defeated, but there was still one issue. Western countries wanted capitalism, and the Soviet Union did not, which obviously eventually led to the Cold War, but during this time led to a lot of unease surrounding how things were going to be rebuilt post-World War II. One thing that the Soviet Union decided to do was to build their own nuclear bomb, which they tested in 1949. But unfortunately, during the same year, the country was also experiencing another famine. And on top of that, they also had a state-enforced campaign that killed both Jewish people and intelligent people called the Doctor's Plot. But here's the thing, despite all of the things I mentioned, specifically within the Soviet Union, Stalin was seen in a relatively positive light. He had a cult of personality, he led the Marxist-Leninist movement, and by his followers, he seemed to be the champion of socialism and the man of the working class, although millions of them died. Regardless, at the time, Stalin was relatively popular, and even to this day, in post-Soviet countries, there are old people that still remember times before the Soviet Union fell, where they look at those times fondly, and they miss those times, and they wish that the Soviet Union was reestablished, which is unfortunate because a lot of the countries that are now post-Soviet are riddled with corruption, not allowing them to actually prosper in a capitalistic society. But that's completely beyond the scope of this video. Joseph Stalin died at the age of 74 on March 5th, 1953. He passed away in his personal residence after suffering a stroke. But even though he was now dead, mass murders caused by him didn't stop. What I mean is, following Stalin's death, there was massive funeral celebrations that took place. Like I mentioned, he was relatively popular within the Soviet Union. And because of this, hundreds of thousands of people attended his multi-day funeral. And unfortunately, because of people being so excited or simply so cramped and a lack of fire regulation, at least 109 people were confirmed to have been killed in a crowd crush that took place at the funerals. And it's estimated that it's completely possible that over 1,000 people in total died because of the funeral services that took place. This is one of the more interesting situations we've talked about so far, because at this point, no other dictator was still fully in control and still relatively popular at the time of their death. Up until Stalin, every other dictator either had to go into hiding to die peacefully or was executed. So this one was interesting. What else is interesting is the fact that I post videos every week. Feel free to subscribe. Let's move on. Saddam Hussein. We actually already discussed Saddam Hussein 2 videos ago in our video about bad people that did good things, but in this video, we're not going to discuss any of his good deeds at all. As an adolescent, Saddam attended a nationalistic high school in Baghdad, and after high school, Saddam studied at an Iraqi law school for 3 years when he dropped out in 1957. At that point, he joined the Pan-Arab Ba'ath Party, basically the Iraqi regional branch of the Arab Socialist Party. Interestingly, during his rise to power, Saddam was actually involved in an assassination conspiracy to kill Qasim al-Rashid, who opposed the notion of Pan-Arabism. Although during the assassination attempt, Saddam, who was supposed to provide cover to the other shooters, actually began shooting first, which ended up disorganizing the entire operation, and the person they were trying to assassinate was only hit in the arm and survived. Interestingly, although this assassination attempt was failed, the party that Saddam was a part of, which only had less than 1,000 members, was now gaining widespread coverage and attention because of the attempt. But interestingly, this wasn't necessarily bad publicity. It didn't stop his future political career at all. And he spent the following years in jail, conniving with other small political groups, theorizing other assassination attempts, and ultimately participating in coups. Which brings us to the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Saddam has built himself a reputation of being a progressive and effective politician. And because of this, he found himself becoming the vice president. And he was vice president during the 1973 energy crisis that saw oil prices skyrocketing, which directly benefited Iraq because they were, of course, selling that oil. And with this extra revenue, they were able to help revitalize and strengthen Iraq, pulling people out of poverty and developing and industrializing the country. But of course, his time as vice president and as president is not without its many, many flaws. For example, the use of mustard gas and nerve gas on innocent civilians, which resulted in thousands and thousands of deaths. The Dujal massacre, which took place in 1982 under his rule, which resulted in the execution of 148 men and boys. And on top of both of these things, just general blatant disregard for international law and numerous violations of international borders, some of which were actually subsidized by other countries because Iraq was dealing with the Iranians and Kuwait. Some countries kind of overlooked the war crimes of chemical warfare to help support Iraq because they were fighting with Iran. And by countries that were supporting this, I mean the United States and the United Kingdom. Throughout the entirety of his rule, the divide in Iraq was massive. Some people seeing him as a hero and a great leader, others seeing him as a horrible dictator, and it really all depended on what tribe you belonged to. But in March of 2003, the US invaded Iraq, ending his nearly 24-year regime, which was at this point internationally known for repression, brutal purges, and massive violence used to maintain absolute power. just classic dictator stuff. And during this US invasion in the fall of Baghdad in 2003, Saddam Hussein went into hiding, but he was caught only a few months later when US forces found an underground bunker. After Saddam was captured, he was held in the States and then transferred back to Iraq, where he was put on trial for a lot of the crimes he committed as president, specifically the attack I mentioned in 1982. This trial ended on November 5th, 2006, and Saddam was found guilty and was sentenced to death by hanging. And interestingly, this hanging took place during the Islamic holiday of Eid, which is odd because we also discussed an execution that happened earlier that took place on Christmas. I'm not sure if that's just how the dates lined up or if that was intentional, but regardless, it happened. And a video was actually taken of the execution by somebody who recorded it on their cell phone. And this video was leaked and widespread online and on the news. And as I mentioned, depending on who you were, this execution was seen as justice finally being served or a massive injustice, all depending on what you believed and which tribe you belonged to. Interestingly, Saddam actually requested and tried hard to be executed via firing squad, but in court, that request was denied, and he was obviously hung. Adolf Hitler. Once again, and for the last time, we are back in World War II. Likely one of the most notorious people to come out of the entire World War. The rise of Hitler is likely one of the most well-known and well-talked about of all of the people on this list. So for that reason, I'll keep it brief. Interestingly, unlike basically everybody we've talked about in this video, Hitler was not born in the country that he ended up ruling. Hitler was born in Austria, not Germany. Although being born and living very close to the German border, he felt a very strong sense of German patriotism. And also, interestingly, unlike almost everybody else in this list, Hitler wasn't instantly indoctrinated into politics as a young person. He actually spent his childhood and young adulthood in the arts, not in politics. As an 8-year-old child, he took singing lessons and attended a choir, and at that point even considered becoming a priest. Just imagine if Hitler ended up becoming a priest. That's an insane thought. At the age of 18, Hitler was on his own and flat broke, unable to get into the School of Arts or Architecture because he did not have the secondary school credentials. And this is where we hear that, oh, if only he got accepted into art school. He was not accepted into a university for arts and architecture. And that's where things began to change. Because at the same time, in 1914, when he was rejected from school, the First World War broke out. Hitler enlisted, even though he was an Austrian citizen, he was able to fight with German forces, likely by accident, and following an injury that took place in the war, he returned home from the war in 1917. I can only assume that the hard upbringing that Hitler had, combined with the war, Hitler described his role in World War I as the greatest of all experiences. And I can only assume that this is really the first time he felt a sense of purpose in his relatively tumultuous life so far. And I don't think it would be inaccurate to say that this, in the following years, would really spark what Hitler would end up becoming. After World War I was over, Hitler was looking for job opportunities and was actually appointed as an intelligence agent to influence and infiltrate the German Workers' Party. This was Hitler's official introduction into politics. And it only took from 1919 to 1933 for Hitler to rise through the ranks and go from a newly appointed intelligence agent to becoming the official dictator with a totalitarian regime within Germany. Throughout this totalitarian control from 1933 to 1945, Hitler committed more war crimes and human rights violations than you could possibly imagine, with the most notable of which being the Holocaust. But in 1945, his reign of terror and genocide was coming to a close, which brings us to late April 1945 in a bunker in Berlin. Hitler got word that Soviet troops were not only approaching Berlin quickly, but surrounding Berlin, and he had no other option than to go underground. While underground, he still tried to command what he could, although it was obvious that his people were no longer listening. And some of his most high-ranking officials behind his back were trying to negotiate a surrender, when all Hitler wanted was people to fight to the very death. He wanted no expense spared when it came to trying to get out of the situation, even though at this point, he knew it was hopeless. Hitler had gotten word that the Soviets had entered Berlin and that there was absolutely no chance of him surviving. He decided, like the egomaniac that he was, that he wouldn't let anybody else take him out or even imprison him or anything of the sort. So while in the bunker with his brand new bride that he also married in the bunker, Hitler used a pew-pew to scratch his head. And I do apologize for the censorship, but I really have bills to pay. Following Hitler doing that, his wife, Eva Braun, took a pill that made her not feel so good, and the two were no longer around. But it doesn't end there, because following Hitler's instructions, Hitler didn't even want his dead body to be captured by the Soviets. So following his orders, some of Hitler's helpers collected his and Eva's bodies and burned them and then hid the ashes. Although the burned remains were eventually found by the Soviets, and dental records did confirm that these burnt remains belonged to Hitler. And it was then where the hellish, nightmarish Nazi regime was officially concluded. How humans survived in every time period. This is you, the average, everyday, modern human being. Historically speaking, you are soft, squishy, and weak. And although you may not look like it, you are an apex predator, residing at the very top of the global food chain. But this has not always been the case. And this evolution of human dominance has taken hundreds of thousands of years to manifest. And where it's gotten us is you laying on the couch ordering Uber Eats without a care in the world. But the struggles that humanity has faced to get us to this very position is anything but pretty. And it's for this very reason that we are going to be investigating exactly how humans endured and survived every era of history, as well as seeing what it would take for a modern human to survive in previous time periods. Let's begin. The Stone Age. The first thing you're going to notice after being dropped in the Stone Age is the sheer shock of how little you truly have. In the Stone Age, you have no phone, wallet, glasses, watch, clothes. You are truly left to your own devices, and it's up to you to figure out how to survive. Luckily, not too far in the distance, you notice a small tribe of humans, and you know better than to interact with them, so you start by observing them. One of the first things you notice is how little these people have. This small tribe of humans have animal pelts draped over their body, and beyond that, appear to only have a pile of rocks and sticks at their disposal. The settlement that they're in is rudimentary and looks almost temporary, and that's because humans at this point in the early Stone Age are still primarily nomadic, meaning that long-term settlements aren't established yet. And although these people are occupying this area now, they likely won't be there in a few months, as they will likely seasonally follow animals in different weather patterns. Taking a closer look at this pile of sticks, you notice that they're not just sticks, they're actually tools. And these rocks that they're carrying all serve a purpose. Some of these longer sticks have pointed, jagged rocks at the ends, while some of the shorter sticks have large black rocks attached to them. And you notice that these are spears and obsidian axes. You notice one of these people actually creating these tools. They are literally using stones to carve out other stones. At this point, you're already taking a mental note of how simple the Stone Age appears to be in comparison to the modern day. And while that is definitely true, it's important to also note that just because something is simple, it does not mean that it's easy. Besides just sitting around and crafting stone tools that literally define this entire time period, there are a lot of other skills required to survive. One of the more unlikely culprits is actually social skills, which may seem a bit random, but when you think about it, your tribe in the Stone Age is literally your lifeline. Every aspect of life is so time-consuming and takes so much effort. Collecting food, cooking food, fabricating tools, preparing pelts, migrating. Literally everything takes so long. And it truly does take a village in the Stone Age just to support each other, because everybody plays their role. We are talking about real hunter-gatherer times. And it's for this reason that you need to provide value to the group that you live in. Because if you are in a group and you are unable to perform in any aspect of your tribe, there's a very likely chance that you're going to be exiled. If your gathering sessions are consistently unfruitful, and if you are simply not pulling your weight in the group, then the entire group is going to have to make the decision between picking up your slack or cutting off the weakest link and exiling you from the tribe. And during a time where every day is a struggle to survive, you do not even have the luxury of picking up anybody else's slack. And for the edgy lone wolves watching this video, being alone in the Stone Age may not seem like such a bad thing, until you realize that not only does every aspect of life require a group to truly thrive, but in this time period, you're also susceptible not only to nature, but natural predators. Because that's right, in the Stone Age, humans definitely have natural predators. And if one of these predators see a lone human walking around, they're either going to assume you're old, sick, exiled, lost, and it doesn't really matter which one is the case, because in any of those instances, you are vulnerable, meaning that a predator can easily make you lunch. With this new realization, you decide to introduce yourself to this group and make yourself at home, because the only way you as a modern person has any chance is by making some good friends. Fortunately, this tribe takes you in, but you are tasked with your first job, making fire. Another essential skill of Stone Age survival. As you gather a few sticks, you realize that the entire tribe is looking at you. And they didn't give you this task as a job, they gave it to you as a test. Because if you can't start a fire, then there is absolutely no way you can pull any weight, and they're better off leaving you behind. Although fortunately for you, you watched Survivor Man a time or two and spun a stick on a log like your life depended on it, getting a kindling going, and then a small fire, proving your worth to the group and ensuring your survival, at least for that day. As the day goes on, you are informed that it's now time to hunt. The tribe has sharpened tools, a new fire, and it's time to eat. And you're being invited to hunt with the tribe. With no other option, you accept the offer and you begin on the journey. One of the first things you realize is that while these people may be human, they are definitely not the same as you, because their endurance is next level. These hunters that you are struggling to keep up with can seemingly run for days. And not only that, they know exactly where they're going and they can read the landscape like the back of their hands. This deep connection to the landscape you inhabit is crucial for long-lasting survival in the wild. And as a modern human, it's a skill set you're going to have to develop. But for a Stone Age human, this is the only life you know, because you are still feel deeply connected and ingrained in nature. After a successful hunt, you return back to the camp exhausted, while the others you went out with seem barely phased at all. And that's because for you, this was the workout of a lifetime. But for these prehistoric people, this was simply everyday life. And this experience gave you a lot of context into how humans survived in the Stone Age. Survival wasn't a hobby or a job or entertainment. Survival was a daily task, day in and day out. And there was no work-life balance because your life was work. And anything you needed, you had to work for. The clothes on your back, the food in your stomach, the wood in the fire, the stone on your spear, the cave that you're sleeping in. Everything required effort. And with that, we understand that Stone Age humans survived because of their deep understanding of the landscape that they inhabited. And these skills allowed them to consistently find places to live temporarily or even long term. And on top of their geographical knowledge, their ability to fashion tools out of materials simply laying on the ground is extremely impressive and allowed them to not only catch animals and protect themselves, but also to create clothing and process food and make other tools. And with that, if you could understand the landscape and develop your own tools, then the only other thing you really needed was the ability to create fire. And with that, you had every aspect of life essentially covered. Besides, obviously, shelter and water, but those are also part of understanding the landscape, because the water that you get comes from natural sources. And during the early Stone Age, most of the places you inhabit are also typically natural structures, or extremely simple structures made using natural materials. Because of this experience you've had with these Stone Age people, you've gained a newfound respect for prehistoric humans. And although you now have a better understanding of how cave people lived, you also are very certain that you want to spend no more time during the Stone Age, because you've been spoiled by the modern day, and the Stone Age is interesting, but it also makes camping look like a 5-star resort. And with that, we decide it's time to move on to the next time period. The Bronze Age. One of the first things you need to be aware of before we drop you into the Bronze Age is this. The Stone Age literally took place over the course of millions of years. But the Bronze Age is where we truly see the beginning of human technological development hit an exponential point. Because what humans are about to develop over the next couple thousand years is going to make the development over the millions of years in the Stone Age seem like child's play. Although it was obviously a necessary part of our human development. After being dropped in the Bronze Age, you almost don't recognize the world that you were looking at. Obviously, there are some glaring similarities between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, but the differences are stark. One of the first things you notice is that the people aren't wearing pelts anymore. They're wearing clothes. And now you feel underdressed because you're the only one wearing a loincloth. But beyond just the clothing that people are wearing, society looks completely different than it did in the Stone Age. In the Bronze Age, we see people begin to create settlements. And with that, we see agriculture, we see animal farming, we see settlements. And for the first time, we see two very important innovations. We see metal forging and we see the wheel. The collection and forging of metals is what obviously separates the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. And while upgrading from obsidian tools to copper swords is definitely an improvement and ensures that tools are able to last a lot longer, it isn't the only notable change by far. Having tools made in a new material is cool, but having a new material that allows the door to open for expertise to flourish and for unique tools to exist definitely opened up the floodgates for more innovation. With metal forging existing, we now have a method for creative people to develop and hone in their skills. And instead of relying on using a dull rock to sharpen a sharp rock, we now have the opportunity to create nearly anything we can imagine, at least for the time. And with that, the simple introduction of this new metal alone, society begins to evolve, because now we have artisans and experts, and then we have early jobs and an early economy based off of these new items and metals. And things are already developing at a pace quicker than I can describe. But besides just having new metals and new jobs because of it, we also have the wheel. And the wheel was crucial for literally mobilizing society. Not only did we see civilization establish settlements in the Bronze Age, but we also saw settlements become connected because of the wheel. And these settlements became connected through trade routes and war. Two things that also went on to further evolve society. However, even with all of these revolutionary technological developments, the Bronze Age to a modern human still seems like an extremely slow and barbaric way of life. And for that reason, you need to learn exactly how to acclimate to this time period. Fortunately, the development you found yourself near has almost everything a human could need. And one of the first things you do is get yourself some new drip, because that loincloth had the ladies and the men looking at you the wrong way. Walking through this village, you understand that community is still extremely important. However, this stage of the game, by game I mean history, is a lot less grindy. Instead of spending all day looking for berries, you're simply picking the berries in the garden. Instead of spending the entire day looking for a goat, you are simply taking one from the farm. And instead of feeling like you have to do everything all the time, for the first time you feel like you actually have the opportunity to specialize and focus on something. And although things are definitely looking a lot better than they did in the Stone Age, in the Bronze Age, you still need to make sure that you're carrying your own weight. Because at the end of the day, you need to put a roof over your head and food in your stomach today. And what that means is you once again need to provide value. And while the value you provide in the Bronze Age looks different than the Stone Age, the general concept still applies. There are no free lunches, and if you want to survive, you need to do something. Although in the Bronze Age, there are more opportunities. Since your goal is survival, you decide that joining any sort of army is not for you, and you're also not interested in any form of combat sport involving a copper sword. You briefly ponder potentially becoming a criminal, because then anything you want is free. Although, after seeing how basically every crime can be punishable by death during this period of time, you realize that a modest job may be your best way of surviving. Even though there's a lot more technology in the Bronze Age, the components required for life are still the same. You need food, water, and shelter. And the one job that you identify that can provide you all of this is farming. Because of the new tools and methods introduced in the Bronze Age, mass farming is at an all-time high, at least relatively. And for that reason, there's a lot of opportunity to work within farming. And a lot of these jobs provide food, shelter, and water in return for your all-day, indefinite, back-breaking labor. It's not glamorous, but your goal here is survival. You're not trying to be rich or famous, you simply just want to live a long, safe life. But after making yourself useful on the farm and breaking your back, even though you now have new tools, a wheel, and new clothes, you decide it's time to continue moving. Because although the Bronze Age and Stone Age feel like night and day in human history, you know that there's a lot more to come and you want to experience it. The Iron Age. The difference between Bronze Age and Iron Age is not nearly as shocking as the difference between Stone Age and Bronze Age. However, it doesn't mean that the advancements are any less important. During the Iron Age, we don't necessarily see an entirely new way of life, although we see an expansion upon the previously established way of life in the Bronze Age, with some improvements. Obviously, the most notable difference being the new metal at play. Iron changed the metal tool game like never before, and that's because it was readily available and extremely durable. And because of that, iron tools became economical, and what that means is not only was there some tools, there was a lot of tools. And with more tools being in the hands of more people, human development began to ramp up even quicker than before. And because of this, we start to see society truly hit scale. Farming, both agriculture and livestock, became more optimized. Iron mining became more optimized. Metal forging became more optimized, and there was more of it. And because of this, everything that the Bronze Age really established, the Iron Age was able to run with. And that's kind of a common theme in every time period so far. Every lesson, development, technique developed in the previous time period can be applied and expanded upon in the next one. And that's kind of life in general, if you think about it. Regardless, with yourself being dropped in the Iron Age, my advice to you on surviving wouldn't be much different from the Bronze Age. Make sure you are refining your social skills to have a good circle of people around you, and make sure that you are obeying the law. Make sure you're not getting yourself into any wars, and make sure that you're making yourself valuable without making yourself a target. Since you already have experience from farming in the Bronze Age, I would recommend farming once again in the Iron Age. You could make a living, afford shelter, afford food, be around water, and if everything took a nasty turn, you would at least have the skill set to provide for yourself if all else fails. And might I add, in this time period, to take up some sort of sword fighting hobby in the background. Not because you want to fight in a war, but because you want to be able to protect yourself in any situation. And like they say, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. The medieval era. One of the first things you notice after landing yourself specifically in medieval England is the difference in people. Their civilizations like you saw in the Iron Age, although this civilization is different. It's obviously more developed, but one of the biggest things you notice is the sheer amount of class separation. Most of the people you see roaming the streets don't look super different than they did in the Iron Age. Although you do see almost a new class of people. You see merchants with elaborate clothing. You see nobility with clean robes, and you even get a glimpse of the king going down the street. And it's with this initial impression that you realize that you're not in Kansas anymore. Besides the differences that you see, there's a big difference that you can smell. Because being smack dab in the middle of medieval England, you can smell everybody and everything. And that's because with how developed cities have become, people are being more and more crammed into smaller and smaller places. And for that reason, everybody is literally in everybody else's business. And if you thought working on a farm in the Iron Age smelled bad, well, just smell medieval England. And make sure you keep your mouth closed if you see anybody on the second floor dropping fudge popsicles out of a bucket from their window. After noticing this rather large wealth gap, you understand that if you want to survive, your best chance is by at least having a bit of money. Because the vast majority of poor serfs, unless they are skilled laborers that are able to stay in town, are typically sent to the countryside for agricultural jobs. And while that was something you have experience in, you don't want to slave your life away anymore. And the life of a serf in medieval times is typically not one that screams longevity. Long hours, poor food, poor healthcare, no education, unsafe work conditions. There's a lot that could go wrong. And for that reason, with your goal of surviving, you want to have at least a few shillings in your pocket. You end up cozying up to a local sword merchant. And while this is a suitable side gig and you're able to learn the business and grow within the company, you realize that this society is a lot more complex than previous times. Obviously, royalty is relatively new in your historical travels, but on top of this, religion is a massive staple, not only in day-to-day life, but also in your survival. In medieval England, the Roman Catholic Church ruled over everything. And for that reason, if you were not following the rules of the church, you could be fined. And if you publicly disobeyed or potentially disagreed with the church, you could be killed. Which is why you quickly begin to study the Bible and learn a few prayers in Latin. After getting your side gig and getting familiar with the local customs, you are now met once again with the harsh reality of sickness. While human development has brought us new major cities, we are now experiencing the downfall of some of these overcramped and unsanitary cities, specifically plagues. And if you just happen to be living through 1348, your best chance of survival would be leaving the city immediately and taking the skills you learned in the Stone and Bronze and Iron Age to live off the land yourself. Because during the plague, even buying bread from somebody could be a death sentence. But outside of these relatively niche plague times, there is still the overarching lack of healthcare. Obviously, there was basically none in any of the previous time periods, but in the medieval era specifically, there was at least development with healthcare, but a lot of these treatments were actually more harm than good, meaning that if literally anything went wrong, whether it be a broken bone or a small cut, if you weren't in perfectly good shape and perfectly healthy, you were much closer to death than you would have ever been in the modern day. But even if you were lucky enough to be surviving in the medieval era during a time when there was no plague, you had a job that was making you not a poor serf, you still had to hope to God, literally, that there was not a war on the horizon. Because if you, as a young adult, were summoned to war, you essentially had no option. Either go to war or be killed for not going to war. And if you went to war and got injured, your chances of dying were high. And if you went to war and got injured and survived, once you came home, you would not be able to continue your work and you would essentially be poor on the street and likely die on that street. And with that hard lesson learned, you realize that if you want to survive in medieval times, you need to not only work a job, but be savvy enough to earn a higher than normal income. You have to religiously follow the church. You must never break a law. You must never upset a royal. You must never be in bad health or become injured. And you must hope that a war never breaks out that requires your assistance. And spoiler alert, there was a lot of wars during the Middle Ages. And while you actually find the Middle Ages rather interesting, you know that this was not the place for you. And you decide to continue your journey. The early modern era. The early modern era is the shortest time period we're going to discuss on this list, besides the modern era, which is still ongoing. The early modern era was only 300 years long, spanning from 1500 to 1800 AD. But this time period was pivotal for human civilization. And while it consists of a lot of the things we've already discussed previously, the early modern era specifically is defined not by medals, but by intellectual pursuits, specifically in major developments in both world exploration and scientific pursuits. With the prosperity that Europe saw during the Middle Ages, they decided that their best next course of action during the early modern era was to begin expanding, which is why we saw a plethora of colonization during this time, because these European countries wanted more land, more wealth, more power. And because of this, the early part of the early modern era is rather tumultuous. There is a lot of religious instability, and also instability across the globe with this newfound colonization. And because literally so many revolutions took place during the early modern era, if you have to be a part of one of the revolutions, I would recommend being a part of the scientific revolution, specifically by trying to get your name in the same group as Copernicus, Galileo, or Newton. And while you might be thinking, I'm not nearly as smart as any of those guys, you don't need to be. Because if you're a modern person just being dropped in the early modern era, then you have a plethora of knowledge that you could use to change the world early and make yourself not only a remembered scientist, but also literally a god. But also keep in mind that revealing too much knowledge would actually not get you respected, it would get you killed, because you would just seem crazy. And if you challenge the status quo too much, well, that wouldn't be good for you. So with your goal of survival, you drop hints about knowing things and become a respected philosopher, making sure that you stay vague, but also inspirational. Near the end of the early modern era, you begin to see things that you recognize from the modern era. You see democracy, capitalism, banking, personal individuality, and this is all a part of the Enlightenment near the end of the early modern era. And it's with this realization that you remember that you're almost home. You've been going through almost all of human history, and now your final step is going back to the modern day. And while your time in every different time period has been brutal and tough, and you've missed even the most modern of luxuries like Uber Eats and a toilet, you've definitely grown to respect previous eras of history, and you've had a major boost in respect for people who came before you, and essentially paved the way for you to live the comfortable life you live today. And with that, you realize that there's only one more place to go, and that's returning home, the modern era. Obviously, if you want to know how to live in the modern era, go look in the mirror or ask your grandpa. But I want to point out some interesting nuances that separated the early modern era from the modern era, because the modern era isn't just this week or this month. It dates back all the way to the early 1800s. And even though it was less than 200 years ago, the early 1800s is a much different time and lifestyle than the 2020s. One of the biggest technological advancements during the modern era is the Industrial Revolution, which swept through Europe, America, and eventually the world, and changed not only jobs and economies, but lives forever. But the Industrial Revolution wasn't just the building of factories and a boost in manufacturing jobs. It also meant further development in urban areas, specifically with developments in mining and transportation, with trains, buggies, and eventually cars becoming popular. And these tools, once again, changed the world and allowed further and further exponential development. And while this Industrial Revolution definitely improved the quality of life of some, there is undoubtedly still horrible labor conditions existing for those working in factories. And this includes women and children being paid next to nothing for backbreaking and then sometimes deadly jobs. But it's once again these hardships that people go through that brings us to the modern day, 2025. Now, this is not to say that the modern day is perfect, because it's not by any means. And this also isn't to say that every hardship in the past has been justified because it led us to today. Although, what I am trying to say is that the world we live in today is a work in progress and has been developed by hundreds of thousands of years of human development, driven by the urge to do better and never give up. Humans have always endured, persevered, and grew. And if you look at the timeline of humanity, that is a fact. So, although in the modern day we may have our own issues and be squishier than we used to be, we are still actively participating in this ongoing pursuit of human development, and humans, at the end of the day, are badasses. While there's definitely issues in the modern day, life has never been more comfortable and convenient, and easier to at least stay alive in. The most diabolical human experiments ever performed. The child and the ape experiment. Have you ever seen those cute videos of, new families, a young couple and they have a baby and they have a puppy and the puppy and the baby are playing together? Yeah, the ape and the child experiment is basically the worst possible version of that. This experiment takes place in 1931. It was conducted by a young couple, Winthrop and Luella Kellogg, and they recently just had a baby boy named Donald. And when Donald turned 10 months old, he had another sibling, not a brother, but a sister. However, this sister was not biological or even related by species. This sister that he was given was a 7-month-old chimpanzee named Gwa. Winthrop Kellogg was a psychologist who specifically worked on the psychology of animals, primarily dolphins, rats, and birds. And him and his wife decided that it would be best to take their work home and to up the ante by not only experimenting with a chimpanzee, but also by effect their own child. The couple planned on documenting this entire experiment that they were about to begin. And the specific point of this experiment was to study the environmental influence upon early behavior, which what that really meant was they wanted to see if they raised a baby and an ape the exact same way at the exact same time, if they could get a similar outcome. And you can probably already see where this is going. It's speculated that they initially thought that this experiment would be relatively harmless and that their child would simply be a baseline to refer to when it comes to early education. And only the chimpanzee would be tested on because only the chimpanzee was being treated differently, right? The child hanging out with the chimpanzee wasn't going to be affected by this. Well, I won't spoil it, but it wasn't fully accurate. Interestingly, the Kellogg's thought they were doing the moral thing because initially they actually wanted to test the opposite. They wanted to see what the effects of having a child grow up in the wild would be. But because it's extremely dangerous and unethical to leave a baby in the woods, they were like, oh, well, why don't we just take an animal and put it in a human condition to see exactly how smart a chimpanzee can be and what their true natural potential would be if they were raised as a human. When you put it in that perspective, it may almost kind of seem logical, right? Regardless, after Donald and Gwa were introduced, the tests began. And over the next 9 months, there was full-time grueling tests taking place between Gwa and Donald to see exactly how a baby chimp and a baby human would compare and develop as they were both being treated the exact same as a normal baby would. Although, was Donald really being treated like a normal baby? They likely never had the time to ask that question because over these 9 months, there were so many experiments, tests, practices. There was literally no time to think about anything besides the daily tasks. Winthrop, during this time, literally took a leave of absence from his job to focus on this experiment full time and even moved his family down to Florida to be closer to the university where he had gotten this chimp and where he would be submitting his research. Now, after 9 months of daily testing and analysis, the experiment was mysteriously stopped. And while almost every aspect of this experiment was relatively well documented, the reason for why it stopped was not, which led to a bit of speculation. One primary belief is that they ended the experiment due to the rapid growth of Gwa compared to Donald. Obviously, animals develop a lot faster than humans do, and in 9 months, Gwa could have doubled or tripled in size, making her possibly dangerous to baby Donald. However, another leading theory is due to the fact that Donald was picking up more chimpanzee tendencies than the Kellogg's would have liked. And this is supported by some of the documents that the Kellogg's made. They even admitted near the end of the test that Donald was behind when it came to communication, and really only had a very small vocabulary of words and wasn't babbling much, and typically would only mimic the noises that Gua would make. Regardless of the reason, after 9 months, the experiment was closed. And while the experiment was well documented and completed at this point, the story doesn't end there. Because unfortunately, only a year after Gua was returned to the facility that she was taken from, she passed away from pneumonia. And Donald, on the other hand, was reported to have suffered from social and emotional issues through his young and adult life, and even ended up taking his own life at the age of 43. At this point, with the experiment basically being almost 100 years old, it's kind of up to speculation to try to understand if the parents knew that Donald would simply be a control for this test that they were doing, or if they knew that this experiment could potentially have detrimental side effects to their own child. But regardless, it happened, and now we know the consequences. And unsurprisingly, the ethics of this experiment were widely criticized, specifically because they used their own human child in such a strange and long-lasting experiment. And while some of the findings from this experiment did end up becoming useful in scientific research of animals and humans, one has to ask themselves, is it worth experimenting on your own child? Is it worth experimenting on any human? Is it worth experimenting on animals? That's a question I'll leave to you. Regardless, the child and the ape experiment is rather unfortunate. And if you can believe it, this is the most tame human experiment we're going to discuss in this list. They only get worse from here, and we're only just getting started. Let's move on. The Little Albert experiment. In the first experiment, we discussed a child who was not given the proper opportunity to develop like a normal child should, and unfortunately, they became a victim of that. Although in this experiment, we do discuss another child. However, they weren't just not given the opportunity to develop, they were forced to develop negative connections in their brain. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but this is literally a Pavlov experiment that took place on children, not dogs. Let me explain. The Little Albert experiment was conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner, and took place in 1920. And the point of the Little Albert experiment was to see if they could condition children to fear something that would typically not provoke fear. Already off to a great start. Watson famously claimed that if he was given 12 newborn children, he could condition them in their upbringing to turn them into any sort of person you could desire. A lawyer, a doctor, a murderer. Anything you wanted a person to be, you could condition them to become that during their early years. I definitely do not think we should be giving John B. Watson any children. Regardless, in the 1920s, somebody did. Watson was able to get his hands on a 9-month-old baby, known as Albert, for his experiment. Watson planned on using classical conditioning methods, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, because it was the same method that Pavlov used to condition dogs. The experiment began with little Albert being placed in a room. Watson, his partner, and a rat were all in this room together, and Watson and his partner simply watched how Albert and the rat would interact. At first, they weren't interested in each other until Albert decided to reach out and touch the white lab rat. It was at that point when Rosalie would strike a metal bar with a hammer, making a loud and scary noise, which would obviously upset Albert. And they would continue to do this time after time in this room every time Albert decided to reach out to the lab rat, until the point where Albert wanted nothing to do with this lab rat. Albert had associated this lab rat with a scary, unpleasant experience. And because of that, this lab rat that he was curious about, he was now afraid of. And not only now was this little Albert afraid of mice, but his fear began to become generalized. They learned this because after the experiment, when they handed Albert a teddy bear, Albert also rejected and gave the same reaction to this fluffy teddy bear that he did to the mouse. And it was theorized that at that point, it wasn't only the mouse that was triggering this negative reaction, but it was any fuzzy object that resembled the white mouse to this baby. Some examples were a white teddy bear, a white rabbit, a small dog, and even a Santa Claus mask. Fortunately, this specific experiment only had one victim, and that was little Albert. There was no control subjects, and the study basically ended there and the paper was published. And while that alone has obvious ethical flaws, once again, the story does not end there. Because Watson was now able to prove that he could condition a child, so what did he do next? Well, naturally, he decided to condition his own children. But he didn't condition his children for fear, but he did have some very interesting parenting philosophies. One of his most popular parenting philosophies was the thought that children should not be given too much attention. Watson believed that you should limit the amount of affection you showed your children. That meant during the day, limiting hugs, no kisses, minimal affirmation, and minimal attention. He literally said that you shouldn't play with your kids because it would disrupt their routine, as if children have routines. He also was a big proponent of sleep training, basically just letting your baby lay in the crib until it cries itself to sleep. Watson believed in all of this, and because he believed this and believed it to be good, he used all of these strategies on his 4 children that he had. Keep in mind, Watson claimed that if he was given newborn children, he could turn them into anything he wanted. So what do you think ended up happening to his 4 children? Let me tell you. Watson's son John suffered from unexplainable migraines and died in his early 50s. His daughter Mary struggled with alcohol abuse almost all of her adult life and attempted to take her life multiple times. Watson's other son James also attempted to take his life, and Watson's 4th child William did take his own life. Candidly, I'm not a parent, but I think it's safe to assume, based off this example and possible common sense, providing your children with a safe, loving environment is likely ideal for them to be raised into happy, healthy people. But what do I know? If you're a parent and you're watching this, let me know your thoughts on this experiment in the comments below. Regardless, the true identity of little Albert was never disclosed. It's unknown whether or not the parents of little Albert knew about the experiment. The long-term effects of this experiment that took place on little Albert are unknown and unfortunately are likely not good based off of the evidence we've seen. And Watson not only unsuccessfully raised his own children, but also influenced an entire generation on how to raise their children, which likely had an interesting impact on society. I think it's important to know that near the end of his life, Watson became rather reclusive and began to denounce a lot of his previous work, stating that he should have not made the books he did or made the claims that he had simply because he didn't have the knowledge yet. And it's even reported that he burned a lot of the physical copies of his experiments that he had in his personal study. You always want to assume the best in people, and maybe Watson just thought that if you gave your children too much affection, they would simply be attention-seeking, unhappy people. And for that reason, if that is truly the case, then it's unfortunate that he made such a detrimental mistake with those that likely meant the most to him. Although there is a very likely possibility that this person simply didn't care about the well-being of people and only wanted the scientific answer he was looking for. I know these entries were a bit similar, and for that reason, I wanted to put them together. Truthfully, I couldn't pick just one to add, so I decided to add both. And because this video gets darker and darker, they obviously had to go side by side. And if you're done hearing about childhood experiments, then buckle up, because this video is about to take a very dark turn. The Aversion Project. If you've watched our first video we made about conspiracy theories, then you'd probably remember me talking about the Canadian gaydar, which was essentially tests that the Canadian government developed to ensure that nobody in the military or police was gay, because if they were, then they were being fired. The Aversion Project was kind of like that, but only unthinkably worse. Like much, much, much worse. The Aversion Project took place in South Africa during the 1970s and 1980s, under the apartheid regime. This entire project was led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, who was a military psychiatrist, and under his control, this entire project was actually carried out by the South African Defense Force, a massive military institution in South Africa. And in the South African military, there was actually a dual policy, which essentially stated that permanent members of the military were not able to be homosexual. You couldn't be gay if you were gonna stay. However, conscripts and temporary members of the military were allowed to be gay. But this isn't because they were a kind and tolerant bunch. The primary reason why this dual policy existed is because the South African military wanted to make sure that nobody was using homosexuality as an excuse to not join the army, which would have likely been very common because at the time, all white men in South Africa were required to serve a certain amount of years in the military. And the government thought if they banned homosexuality, obviously, then all these white men would just be claiming they're gay. Now here's the thing, it doesn't end there. The South African military might have allowed temporary members of the military to, join, as they were legally required to, but another thing they had to do if they were a temporary member of the military who was homosexual is they had to endure forced therapy. And of course, this wasn't talk therapy or to help people suffering from PTSD in the military. This was forced aversion therapy with electric shocks, castration, and even gender reassignment surgeries. The project's ultimate goal was to cure these homosexual military members while they were a member of the military and basically at the will of the military. And because of that, they forced them through psychological torture and medical procedures that they did not want to have done. And on top of this, they didn't just do this to people that admitted they were homosexual. They did this to people that they assumed were homosexual. Meaning that if you were a member of the military at this time and people thought that you were being a bit fruity, or if people just didn't like you and wanted a good excuse to literally torture you, they would accuse you of being gay. And at that point, you could be subject to a laundry list of horrific experiments. Some of the most common things that were done were strapping down these alleged homosexuals and showing them homosexual images. Obviously, it doesn't end there. As they would show these victims homosexual images, they would then electrically shock the victim to try to create a negative connection in the brain towards same-sex relationships, which kind of ties into the Little Albert experiment, which on top of this shock therapy, some soldiers were chemically castrated by being given a concoction of chemicals that the doctors believed could potentially cure homosexuality, or at least all of their evil urges. And one less popular thing they did that still happened was forced gender reassignment surgeries, where these members of the military were literally subject to hormonal treatments and genital surgeries that would alter their sex against their will, which is disturbing and evil and almost ironic, because they're like, okay, we're gonna take all of the gay people out of the military, so we're gonna make them trans. Literally just insane. And it's estimated that anywhere from 500 to 1,000 young men and women were subject to these brutal procedures at the hands of the Aversion Project over the course of the apartheid. It's hard to imagine the sheer terror and agony that was likely being experienced by the victims at this time, but it's even harder to imagine the long-term effects of this essentially torture that took place on these people. There's no doubt that many of the victims that suffered this severe psychological and physical trauma had the rest of their lives altered forever. And specifically for the people that had their genitals mutilated unconsensually, for the percentage of those who survived the surgery, many of them went on to take their own life not long after. The apartheid ended in the 1990s, and the truly disturbing details of the Aversion Project came to light. And Dr. Levin knew he was about to be in big trouble, so he left South Africa and fled to Canada, where he, disturbingly, was able to continue his medical practice. That was until he ironically was convicted of multiple sexual assaults on men. That's right, this person who had been mutilating homosexual and suspected homosexual men and women in South Africa himself was accused by over 30 men of sexual assault. And it was only at that point, after Levin was tried, that he was sentenced to 5 years, which he had already served and he's actually free again, and had his medical license suspended. This story and series of human experiments is truly diabolical. And on top of all of the pain and suffering and discrimination that took place in the South African military, it's almost mind-boggling to me that if Levin didn't assault people in Canada, he would be a free man, and that he served no time or had no legal repercussion for what he did in South Africa. However, I suppose logically it makes sense, because in South Africa, what they were doing was legal. That was the law. If you were gay, you had to go to the military and you had to be cured, or at least treated. So crazy. But at least the story has a bit of a happy ending, because evil people are gonna be evil. And while Levin had a get out of jail free card by going back to Canada, he couldn't go at least a few days without hurting other people. 5 years for over 30 assaults of literal medical patients is not enough in my opinion. The Aversion Project is truly a dark chapter in medical and human rights history. And to this day, the story is a huge reminder of what's possible when you have unchecked power, non-existent morals, and state-backed medical abuse. Before we get to the final entry of this video, I wanted to list a few honorable mentions, or I suppose dishonorable mentions. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a truly diabolical human experiment, and if you want to learn about that, I actually talked about it in this video about American conspiracy theories. The monster study of 1939, I actually talked about in my first video about human experiments, and the Unit 731 experiment is likely one of the most diabolical human experiments to ever take place. And the only reason why it's not in this video is because I also talked about it in my last video. So I just wanted to address these quickly. Obviously, these are all diabolical human experiments. I'm just not talking about them in this video because I've already mentioned them in other videos. And while we're at it, I just want to say this as well. If you guys enjoyed this video about diabolical human experiments and want more, please let me know in the comments below. Your guys' support is always appreciated, and your feedback is always taken into consideration. But truthfully, I'm just procrastinating at this point because this final entry on the list is literally beyond diabolical. But I suppose let's just rip off the band-aid now. The Nazi medical experiments. This experiment isn't one experiment. It's an entire series of experiments that took place during World War II. And these Nazi medical experiments were carried out in concentration camps under the direction of high-ranking Nazi doctors, primarily Joseph Mengele, who was later known as the Angel of Death. There's a reason why I put this one last. It's important to note that Joseph Mengele was not the only doctor committing these atrocities we're about to get into. There was over a dozen doctors committing horrible human rights violations, and doing so in the name of science, but as you'll see, it's quite far from the truth. Joseph Mengele and the other Nazi doctors performed their experiments on prisoners in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, which primarily housed Jewish and Romani people. And because the people in these camps were not even seen as humans, to the Nazis, they were essentially less than cattle, and the fact that they were coming in by the trainload every day meant that these doctors had an unlimited supply of research subjects that they could do anything they wanted to. And they took full advantage of this cruel, horrific opportunity. The reasons for these experiments varied greatly, from experimenting on people for the benefit of the military, all the way to personal leisure or interest. There was literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different experiments that were performed on these people by the Nazis to gain random pieces of knowledge. I literally can't explain every single one of them, although I will give a few examples of some of the things they did. One disturbing experiment that the Nazi Party did was they would take someone and then put them into a pressure chamber. A chamber that they could either add air pressure to or remove air pressure from to simulate altitude. And what they would do with these victims in the chamber is raise and drop the pressure significantly multiple times. And the reason they were doing this is to see the effects on the human body of quick altitude changes to further their research on what happens when people jump out of planes. Obviously an advantageous military strategy. The experience for the victim inside the chamber had to be horrific. And unfortunately, after cycles of high and low pressure, the doctors would then take these victims and autopsy them while they were still alive, because they wanted to monitor every part of the body while the heart was still beating. They did this one specific diabolical experiment to over 200 people, 80 of which died during the experiment, and the other 120 that survived were executed immediately after. Another disturbing human experiment the Nazis would do involved hyperthermia. They wanted to better understand how it worked and how to prevent it. And how they went about this was by subjecting people to intense conditions. For some examples, they would put people naked into freezing water, monitoring their vitals until they died of hypothermia. Other examples, they would put people in Nazi uniforms and then put them into cold water to see how effective the Nazi uniforms were at preventing hypothermia. And in some cases, they would put people naked in freezing conditions for up to 14 hours to see what would happen to these people. And for those who did survive the intense cold conditions, they would rewarm these people and then subject them to crazy conditions once again. And how they would rewarm these people varied from heat lamps to boiling water. Similar to the Unit 731 experiment, they also tested diseases, specifically injecting deadly diseases into people to see how they would affect them, and also performing live autopsies on these people so they could see the effects of the disease in real time. Almost all of the surgeries and experiments that were performed by the Nazis were performed without anesthesia, meaning that these victims felt almost every grueling detail of what was happening to them, whether it be a live autopsy, or being boiled alive, or having an experimental sterilization take place on your genitals. I think you get the point, but these Nazi medical experiments were insane. Joseph Mengele personally conducted experiments specifically on twins too, with some of the more common experiments having the goal of either changing eye colors or conjoining siblings by simply removing limbs and trying to connect the two people together. Like I said, I would need probably a multi-day long video to go through the entire list of crazy experiments that took place, but at the end of the day, the total goal of all of these Nazi medical experiments lined up basically with the Nazis' radical ideologies that they had. And the purpose of these experiments was to simply improve the survival chances of German soldiers at war and to find the most effective way to sterilize or exterminate people that weren't Aryan. I could go deeper into excruciating detail, but I truly think you get the idea. The experiments performed by these Nazi medical doctors were so detrimental and so well known that it forced these doctors to be tried during the Nuremberg trials, which individually varied in level of consequences, but in general led to a much stricter medical standard, including the Nuremberg Code, which is essentially a set of ethical principles that must be followed when conducting human experimentation. The Nazi medical experiments were almost unspeakably disturbing, and I can only imagine the acts that didn't make it to the history books. And these human experiments that took place by the Nazis are likely only rivaled by the Unit 731 experiment for some of the most diabolical human experiments of all time. And for that reason, I knew I had to discuss it on this video. This video went from strange to upsetting to disgusting to disturbing extremely quick. But don't say I didn't warn you. It's almost mind-boggling the lengths that people are willing to go to in the name of scientific discovery. And while that almost may sound noble out of context, I think that this video, if nothing else, proved that there is a line and rules need to be enforced. The most haunted locations from around the world. I've touched on a lot of creepy things so far in this channel. Serial killers, mythical creatures, folklore, SCPs, but I've never discussed ghosts directly. But today, that changes. And I'm gonna answer all your questions about these haunted locations. Like, how did it become haunted? What ghostly encounters have been recorded? And are these places even really haunted? The year is 1835. And you have just been invited to a beautiful Christmas get-together at one of your friends' manors in the English countryside. The manor was just absolutely beautiful, and this party was packed with notable people, respected colonels, wealthy businessmen, and high-ranking government officials. The night consisted of seemingly endless food and drinks and music, and everything was just so perfect. Late into the night, once the party started to die down, you and a group of friends decided that it was time to go to bed, and you all went your own separate ways to get to your bedrooms. You turn down a hallway and you're finally by yourself and only steps away from your bedroom, when you notice down this hallway there's this woman, a woman that was wearing only brown clothing. You didn't recognize this woman from the party, but this isn't your house, and you didn't know everybody at this party, so you figured it was somebody else also going to their room. This woman was slightly notable due to the apparel that she was wearing, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and you continued to your room and had a good night's rest. You woke up the following morning on Christmas Eve and engaged in the morning festivities. The party was still not done. There was a huge brunch being served, and you and everybody else were not going to miss it. You sit down at a table with some of your friends, one of which being a colonel, and he mentions that last night he saw a rather peculiar woman. Another person at your table asks, what did she look like? And the colonel goes on to explain that on his way to his bedroom, he saw a woman dressed exclusively in brown robes. These robes were dated and tattered and had to have been at least from the previous century. It didn't look right at all. And the colonel was concerned because this woman might have been somebody who either snuck into the manor or was somebody who was obviously lost. But the colonel mentioned once he spotted this woman and walked closer to her and then tried approaching her, he realized this woman had turned around and he got a look at her face. And that's when he claimed that he saw this woman's bright white face with empty eye sockets, and the man was terrified. He didn't scream or run away, but he quickly made his way to his room without asking any more questions. Instantly, your heart dropped to your stomach because you also saw the same woman, but you didn't see her face. And before you could say anything, another woman at the table says, I also saw a lady dressed up in brown. I didn't see her face, but she was standing in the hallway, not saying anything and not moving. And your heart and stomach only sank deeper. You noticed that the host of the party was sitting beside you, and her face was in shock. You asked her, who is this lady wearing these brown rags? And she confessed that she had absolutely no idea. The Christmas party was a formal event and everybody was dressed in their absolute best. Nobody was wearing brown, and there was nobody in the party with sunken in, missing eyeballs. The host of this party quickly stands up on her chair and started clinking a spoon on her glass, causing the conversation in the room to a silence. And the host of the party asked, did anybody see a woman in brown robes anywhere in the manor last night? And to her dismay, numerous people in this room of nearly 100 people raised their hand. The story I just told is based on a real documented encounter that happened in 1835 at a Christmas party. And this story is significant because it is the first recorded sighting of the ghost that is now known as the Brown Lady at the iconic Raynham Hall. And this isn't the only sighting that's taken place, and it's probably not even the most iconic either. And only days after this event, when the host of the party made the staff aware of all of these claims, people literally quit their jobs and never returned out of fear of encountering this strange apparition. But that's not it. There was a handful of sightings on that night in 1835, but the following year in 1836, Captain Franklin Marryat, who is actually a friend of Charles Dickens, heard tell of the legend of this brown lady in the Raynham Manor and spoke to the owner directly and requested that he stay in the most haunted room of them all so he could prove that there was no ghost at all and that this legend simply came to be because the owner of this manor wanted to keep people away from his property. And let's just say he got more than he bargained for. This captain checked into the hotel and stayed in a room that literally had a painting of the apparition hung in the room. Like I mentioned, at this point, the Brown Lady was already a local legend and a common sighting within the hotel. And for the first 2 nights of his visit, the captain had a normal experience. He was staying in a hotel and rather comically was sleeping with a loaded revolver under his pillow just in case. And it was after the second night and the beginning of the third night when everything began to change. Because on night 3, Frederick didn't get a good night's sleep at all. What he did get was a run-in with the Brown Lady. Frederick had just gotten into bed and was ready to go to sleep when he noticed something in front of his door. The door never opened, but there was obviously a shadow of some sort in front of the door blocking the path. The shadow was moving and getting bigger until Frederick realized that this shadow was exactly what he was looking for. He quickly looked at the painting on the wall and noticed that this was the Brown Lady, and she was in his room and she was getting closer to him. Frederick grabs the revolver from under his pillow, points it at the apparition, and screams at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Don't come closer! I'm going to shoot!" But the Brown Lady grew a menacing grin and began to get closer, practically at the foot of his bed, when Frederick pulled the trigger, shot the revolver into the darkness, and the apparition disappeared. 3 hotel workers came into the room to ask what had just happened, and Frederick left the hotel and never returned. I tried to only tell one story per section, but I figured that story was kind of worth going into detail over. Over the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a plethora of other run-ins with the Brown Lady, which brings us to Captain Hubert C. Provant, who not only had a run-in with the Brown Lady, but was able to capture a picture of her. a full-body apparition. And this photo is not only iconic to the Raynham Hall, but it's also one of the most iconic photos in all of ghost hunting. This photo was taken in 1936, and since this photo has been taken, sightings have been few and far between, although many people still believe to this day that Raynham Hall is haunted. Once again, just a crazy story, but you might be thinking, okay, sure, there's this ghost there, but who is this lady and how did she get there? And because this section's getting long, let me boil it down. According to the legend of the Brown Lady, the Townsend family, which was the family that owned the Raynham Manor, after numerous run-ins with this apparition, was able to identify her from one of the paintings that was displayed within the manor. The woman was named Dorothy Walpole, who lived from 1686 to 1726, and was the sister of Robert Walpole, who is considered the first ever Prime Minister of Great Britain. She was the second wife of Charles Townshend, one of the original Townsends that owned the manor, and this man was well known for having a short temper. Allegedly, this man had caught Dorothy with another man, a lord, and as punishment, he locked her in her room in the manor, and she was never allowed to leave. She wasn't allowed to see friends, family, or even her own children. She was a prisoner in her own home until 1926 when she passed away from smallpox. Obviously, that story is upsetting both ways, because if Dorothy did cheat, then that's awful. But Charles had absolutely no right to do any of that whatsoever. If somebody cheats on you, you just break up with them. You say, hey, you get out of my manor, we're done. You don't say, hey, I'm gonna trap you in this room until you die. To this day, Raynham Hall is one of the most iconic haunted locations in all of England. But this is one of the more tame entries on the list, and we're only just getting started. It's the mid-1800s, and you are a medical doctor, Dr. Charles Finney. You live in Atchison, Kansas, and you run a successful medical operation out of your home. This home was something your family recently commissioned, and now you were both living in it and making it your place of business, at least for now. And everything was going smoothly until one night. You were in bed, exhausted after a long day, with your eyes feeling like they're each 1,000 pounds, just begging to be closed. And as you're on the verge of sleep, about to drift off, you hear a knocking at your door. This was extremely uncommon. You obviously had no appointments in the dead of night, and you had no idea who this could be. Reluctantly, you get out of bed and head to your front door. And when you open the door, you notice a woman standing there, holding her young daughter. This woman is frantic and explains that her daughter is in severe pain, and she can't walk, can't move, and she is in endless, excruciating pain coming from her abdomen. The doctor's fatigue instantly wears off, and he's back in work mode. And he invites the woman and the daughter in, and quickly takes them to his basement examination room, where he's able to identify the likely source of all of this pain, an inflamed appendix that was about to burst. The doctor informed the mother that this young girl needed emergency surgery now, and the mother agreed, saying, please, anything to save my daughter. The doctor quickly prepped the location, washed his hands, grabbed his tools, and then began to administer the anesthesia. Once everything was ready and the medicine was administered, the doctor hastily made the first incision. Although little did he know, the anesthesia that he had administered was an improper dose, and this girl, who was already in pain, was now in even more pain, as she could feel everything. And this incision that the doctor had just made was the final straw. Her body went into shock, and not long after, she passed away on that operating table. That young girl's name was Sally, and this story is the reason why this location is known as the Sally House. First thing I'm going to say right off the bat is, as interesting as that story is, there is absolutely no recorded evidence for that story actually being true. And it's largely regarded as a folktale, loosely based in reality. Dr. Charles Finney was a real doctor, and he worked in Atchison, Kansas, and he lived out of his practice that his family had recently commissioned. That all is true. But as far as the story of Sally is concerned, there was no physical evidence. But the reason I mention the story is because it is the story that is most associated with this haunted location. And this haunted location is one of the most iconic in all of the United States of America. So yeah, I wanted to make that distinction primarily because I knew if I didn't, others would say that's not actually true, and well, it's not proven either way, but it is highly debated and not proven that it did happen, so I'll let you make up your mind on that. That story is upsetting and sad, but what does it have to do with haunted locations? Well, that story is kind of where everything began, because after this incident that may or may not have happened in the late 1800s, experiences in the Sally House have been vast and plentiful. Some experiences only consist of hearing a creak or faint footsteps, or even the giggle of a young girl. But other encounters are a lot more sinister, with items being thrown, loud screams being heard, and even visitors being scratched to the point of bleeding. Nearly every former tenant or owner of the Sally House that had been interviewed alleged to have experienced paranormal activity of some sort, typically with consistent attributes across all of the accounts, with some even claiming to see Sally in the window at night, when it was known that no nobody was home. If you're watching this video, you're probably into the paranormal, which means you've probably seen some of your favorite ghost YouTubers stay in this house. Sam and Colby, Nick and Ryan, Exploring with Josh, or even large-scale TV productions. All of these people have stayed in the Sally house and had unique experiences. So for that reason, I'm not going to go too much more into detail. But I will say this, the Sally house hasn't been anybody's personal residence since the 1990s, and in more recent times has been a popular tourist attraction, which kind of makes you think, is the legend of the Sally house real? Or do people just want to keep the story alive because there's a financial incentive? Regardless, the Sally house is regarded as one of the most iconic haunted locations in the United States. The year is 1885. You and your wife are pioneers in New South Wales, Australia, and you have just finished building a double-story late Victorian-style manor on the top of a hill overlooking your local town. This was you and your wife's dream homestead, and you built it with your very own hands. The construction was a labor of love, and now you could enjoy this manor for the rest of your life. This manor became known as the Monte Cristo homestead, and you and your wife enjoyed it up until your deaths. After you and your wife were long gone and your family had no longer lived in the residence, the house essentially was left abandoned. There were caretakers, but unfortunately, the Monte Cristo homestead fell into disrepair. That was until it was purchased by another couple, Reg and Olive Ryan, and they were dedicated to building this beautiful manor back to its former glory, and that's exactly what they did. They took it from a derelict, abandoned home to something that was actually habitable. And once again, the homestead was a home again. And it wasn't long after Reg and Olive moved in that things began to get weird. One late night, only a few days after the Ryans had officially moved in, they were heading home after an event, when they noticed that as they approached their house, they could see bright lights beaming from inside the house, illuminating all of the windows. This caught Reg and Olive's attention, and they were both speechless at what they were looking at. Reg knew that the electricity wasn't even fully finished in the house yet, and for the places that did have electricity, he knew he left no lights on and no lamps burning. Olive was just in sheer terror, and the couple stopped halfway up their driveway in pure awe of what they were looking at. Their home illuminated in the middle of the night for no reason at all. Terrified, the couple approached the house, and the closer they got, the dimmer the lights got. And by the time they actually reached their new home, the house wasn't illuminated at all, and it was as dark as it should have been. The couple theorized that maybe they were just seeing the reflections of the headlight of their vehicle, but deep down they knew that wasn't what they saw at all. And this was only the beginning of the strange encounters that were going to take place over the next few years. Following this event, when the family decided to bring their family cat to their new home, instantly the cat was uncomfortable, which is common. This cat's in a new environment and was just in a car ride, something it didn't enjoy. But as soon as your wife put the cat on the floor, it arched its back and moaned in fear as if it was face to face with another cat. There was nothing there. The cat hissed and screamed and immediately ran out of the house. You, your wife, and your 3 daughters looked for the cat and never found your cat again. Following that event, there was numerous occasions where your daughters claimed that they could see a man's face out the window, which was impossible considering that all of your daughters had bedrooms on the 2nd floor, and there was never any unknown men near or around the property. The family frequently encountered disembodied voices and footsteps and noises, doors opening and drawers closing, and there was truly no explanation for any of it. After years of alleged strange and ghostly encounters, the homestead was converted into a museum, where it showcased antiques, local treasures, and became a tourist attraction with a gift shop, and became known as Australia's most haunted house. Since then, it was featured in numerous TV shows in the 70s, 90s, and early 2000s and 2010s. But very recently, in January of 2025, the homestead was actually closed to the public as Olive Ryan passed away. The Monte Cristo homestead is likely one of the most famous haunted houses in all of Australia. And whether or not the paranormal experiences actually happened to Reg and Olive, or if they just made up stories to have a way to make money off of the house they just restored, I'll let you decide. The year is 1907, and the Dutch have just finished building a beautiful office building for their railway developments in Indonesia. Why the Dutch had a rail company and headquarters in Indonesia is a different conversation. But regardless, this building existed, and it looks really cool, and operated until 1942. That's because the Japanese invaded Indonesia, and they wanted everything, including this beautiful office building. You might be asking yourself, did the Japanese just use it as their office building? Now it's their headquarters in Indonesia? And the answer is no, because once they had total control of this building, they turned an entire wing of the building into a dungeon, specifically for torture and executions, something that wasn't uncommon for the Japanese in World War II. From 1942 until 1945, the building was under Japanese control, until Dutch forces tried to overtake the building from the Japanese. And in October of 1945, a battle took place within the building from Dutch troops who entered through a tunnel underground. Although the Dutch weren't only fighting the Japanese, they were also fighting the Indonesians. And the battle lasted 3 days, and the Dutch eventually retreated. Once World War II ended, the Indonesian army took control of the complex, and it was restored and given back to the Indonesian Railway Company, not the Dutch Railway Company. And in 1992, it was officially considered cultural property of Indonesia. From 1992 until 2009, this building was essentially left to rot, and over this time, it was vandalized, and nature had begun to take it back, with mold growing, parts of the building collapsing and falling apart, and locals beginning to have interesting stories regarding this building. This building, with quite the history, is known as Lawang Sewu, and it is considered one of the most haunted locations in all of Indonesia. Lawang Sewu is very interesting, and its history alone is something to be researched and talked about. During the time that this building was left in disarray, many local teenagers would make it a challenge to touch the building, or go near the building, or go inside the building, or even in extreme cases, stay overnight in the building. This massive building with such a dark and long history became a bit of an icon for all the wrong reasons, and everyone essentially considered it to be an evil, haunted building with dark energy and dark spirits associated with it, which kind of makes sense. Like, just imagine how dark the energy is being in a building, knowing the history. The unspeakable things that happened in this building, I could only imagine left some sort of energetic residue. Regardless, this building became very popular with thrill seekers in Indonesia. And it was over this near 20-year stretch when this building was falling apart that people had many strange encounters within the walls. Hearing voices, hearing footsteps, seeing apparitions, being scratched, being touched. All of these took place within the walls. The Indonesian government actually had plans of restoring this building, but were hesitant to do so because they feared that nobody would use or interact with the building because of the fear associated with it being haunted. But against their better judgment, they continued with the restoration project. And from 2009 to 2011, the building was restored. And in 2013, the building was officially open for tours. And currently, it's a massive hit for tourism in the region of Java, Indonesia, and sees over 1,000 visitors every single day. Now, here's the thing that's kind of interesting about this building. The government has official plans to, quote, eliminate the spooky image in order to attract more visitors, which I think is interesting because that's kind of the opposite of what most ghost house owners want, right? Like, they want to not only maintain but amplify the spooky image in order to bring in people. But I guess the difference is they are wanting to make this a historical landmark, but they are fearing that this image could scare people away, as especially in this region of the world, people are extremely superstitious when it comes to spirits. And there are plenty of locals that avoid this building entirely, as they fear that going near or around this building could lead a spirit to follow you to your home and essentially bring you bad luck and negative energy. So yeah, Lawang Sewu over the last 120 years has had a very long and interesting and unfortunate history, including colonization, war, torture, executions, and other unspeakable things, I'm sure. But as the government allowed this building to sit and rot, the locals decided to have some fun and found a little bit more than fun. And today, the government has restored this building to make it a historical landmark and are doing their best to make sure that nobody talks about the whole ghost part of this building, which is kind of funny. Definitely one of the more obscure entries in this list. Before we get to the last entry on this list, I just wanted to make a quick point. Originally, this video was supposed to have 10 entries, not 5. But because it takes so long to animate the stories associated with each of these sections, I decided to just essentially cut it in half. I didn't want to sacrifice the storytelling or the information for the sake of having more entries on the list. I say this because there is a ton of other crazy, obscure haunted locations that I want to talk about. So consider this video a part 1, and if you guys want that second part, leave a like or leave a comment and I will post another video about the craziest and most obscure haunted locations from around the world. Now, back to the final entry of this list. The year is 1776. You are a healthy adult man living in Venice, Italy. You have a beautiful wife and a newborn son, and unfortunately you are experiencing the harsh wrath of the plague. It's killed numerous friends and family members of yours, but fortunately you, your wife, and your son are safe. For now at least, because you have to work every single day to be able to afford to live. Your family depends on you, and you try to be as safe as possible. That is, until you catch the plague. At this point in time, the government had a protocol for anybody who had caught the plague. and your fate was to be sent to the island of Poveglia, an island that at this point the Italian government was using solely as a quarantine station for those with the plague and other diseases. And that is where you went. You weren't able to say goodbye to your wife or son as it would pose too much risk to them, and you felt confident that if you went to this island, you would quarantine and come back a healthy man and return to your family. But unfortunately, almost as soon as you were shipped to this island, you were never heard from again. Your son was able to grow up through the plague and survive it. As time went on, the plague began to go away. Things began to change. One of the bigger changes that happened was the Italian government was no longer using Poveglia as a quarantine station, but as a remote mental institution. And unfortunately, your son, through the trauma that he experienced growing up in the plague, losing his father, and other hardships that he had in his life, found himself also on the island of Poveglia. This time, not because of the plague, but because of a mental disorder that was at the time not understood. The island of Poveglia at this point had claimed the lives of multiple generations in your family. But sadly, this wasn't unique to your family. Tens of thousands of people had perished on Poveglia Island. And it's because of that dark and death-filled history that Poveglia Island is regarded as not only one of the most haunted locations in Italy, but one of the most haunted locations in the entire world. From the late 1300s until the late 1900s, this small island was inhabited by people and used for multiple different reasons. The two primary reasons, the quarantine station and the mental asylum. There was likely an unspeakable amount of atrocities that took place on this island, and it's for that reason that after it was abandoned, people gained quite the interest in visiting it. The mental hospital was the last official use of this island, but when that institution closed in 1968, not only the building went abandoned, but the entire island became abandoned, leaving the buildings, the belongings, and the history to marinate. But it didn't take long for history buffs and thrill seekers to check it out for themselves. And that's when the legend began to grow of how haunted Poveglia Island really was. I've actually watched a video of somebody not doing a ghost hunt here, but just exploring the island. I believe it was Exploring with Josh I watched, and it's kind of unfortunate because although the history of this island is rather dark, the architecture is still beautiful, and the island itself is really unique. I could only imagine it would be a cool tourist attraction, kind of like the Italian version of Alcatraz. You know how that had a really dark history but became a popular tourist attraction. Even though this entire island has been off limits from the day it closed to today, it's not stopped people from going. And it appears that almost everybody who has gone there has come back with a story, which has led to numerous different paranormal TV shows and even paranormal YouTubers to explore the island for themselves. There are no real famous notable claims of hauntings or specific apparitions on this island. There is just a general consensus among people who have been there that there is no doubt that this island is haunted, which they back up with the history of the building itself. This is definitely an example of a haunted location that I'd be more willing to take seriously simply because there's no financial incentive. This isn't something that somebody owns. Nobody's really gonna make money off of making a legend out of this. It is an abandoned building with a dark history that I'm sure the Italian government just wanted to kind of decay into nothingness. The craziest scams in every time period. The Stone Age. Admittedly, this section is going to be rather short, for a couple of reasons. Primarily being that the Stone Age is literally prehistoric, meaning that everything I'm about to discuss is essentially speculative. Also, because most of human life in the Stone Age was extremely simple, meaning that at this point, human life wasn't even able to comprehend the possibility of deception. If you had something that another human wanted, there was two options. Either they kill you to get the thing, or they die trying to kill you to get that thing. That was realistically the extent of scams in the Stone Age. Keep in mind, the Stone Age literally extends over 3.4 million years worth of history. The Stone Age contains 99.3% of all recorded human history, dating back around 300,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first appeared. So with that being said, what are some scams that could have possibly existed in the Stone Age? And let me present you a few interesting opportunities. Scam number one, the made you look scam. Here's how the scam goes. You are a caveman, and your enemy, also a caveman, comes to ask you a question. You decide you've had enough of his antics and point in the direction that's behind him. This caveman turns around, you pull out your trusty club and hit him in the head. Now, your enemy is dead, and you have just successfully committed a Stone Age scam. In modern terms, that's not much of a scam at all. But when it comes to prehistoric humans, things were simple. Just think about that one episode of SpongeBob that took place in the prehistoric times. That's kind of what we're working with here. But besides the petty theft and petty murder of the Stone Age, I believe believe one of the biggest scams out of the Stone Age was actually the existence of the Stone Age itself. You see, the Stone Age primarily is defined by its use of stone tools, specifically near the very end of the Stone Age. And this is because humans using stone tools signifies the evolution of human creativity, human engineering, human development. Now, you may be thinking, well, of course, we need this human development. This isn't a scam at all. This is beautiful. This is progress. And what I would say to you is, not really. Because look where it's gotten us. As humans, we used to sleep outside under the stars, do whatever we wanted all day, go to the bathroom anywhere. We essentially lived like animals, and it was great. Just look how good your dog or cat has it right now. We used to live like them, but now we wake up to an alarm, we go to a job, we commute, we have anxiety, we have bills. Our bills even have bills at this point. So although this scam may have not taken place in the Stone Age, it definitely started in the Stone Age. And potentially one of the biggest scams of the Stone Age was that one meddling, weaselly little caveman that decided to combine a stick with a rock. And maybe if he was the one who got clubbed, we would still be living that sweet animalistic lifestyle. This first section was a bit silly, but I didn't want to leave this Stone Age out of a video about every time period. But with that being said, as we now transition into recorded history, the scams are going to be historically documented and much more serious. But this is a Trust Me Bro video, so don't expect a documentary. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James. The Bronze Age. Not LeBron's Age. The Bronze Age. Yes, that was corny, and yes, we're keeping it in. We are now in the Bronze Age, the beginning of recorded scams. And the scam I'm going to be speaking about from the Bronze Age involves metal fraud, and also includes the earliest ever recorded customer complaint. Let me explain. The year is circa 1750 BC, right near the end of the Bronze Age. And there is a famous copper merchant named Ea Nasser. Ea Nasser, unsurprisingly, would buy and sell metals, specifically copper. And this merchant was no stranger to customer complaints, with one of the most famous examples coming from a customer named Nani. Nani's specific issue with Ea Nasser was that Ea Nasser was selling bad quality or low quality copper, and that was a big issue for Nani. Unlike the Stone Age, I'm not just making this up. This transaction and subsequent complaint is recorded in commercial tablets. These tablets were actually unearthed with a group of other tablets recording transactions and complaints about the copper quality. And these were all found in a home that was believed to at one point been owned by Ea Nasser, which is by itself just a really cool piece of history. Ea Nasser was a well-known copper merchant in his city and was even a member of an established and, relatively speaking, respected copper guild, meaning that he wasn't just any Joe Schmo. However, these credentials definitely didn't help him with his business dealings, because although he may have been surrounded by proper, integral copper merchants, Ea Nasser was likely nothing of the sort. And this is proven by the famous tablet sent to Ea Nasser from Nani, which has actually been translated, and I'm about to read exactly what Nani said to Ea Nasser, and I'll let you decide whether or not Ea Nasser was a scammer. The tablet reads as follows. When you came, you said to me as follows. I will give Gimosin fine quality copper ingots. You left, but then you did not do what you promised. You put ingots which were not good before my messenger and said, if you want to take them, take them. If you do not want to take them, go away. Who do you take me for, that you treat someone like me with such contempt? I have sent as messengers gentlemen like ourselves to collect the bag with my money, but you have treated me with contempt by sending them back empty-handed several times. And that through enemy territory. Is there anyone among the merchants who trade with Dilmun who has treated me in this way? You alone treat my messenger with contempt. On account of that one trifling mina of silver which I owe you, you feel free to speak in such a way. While I have given to the palace on your behalf 1,080 pounds of copper, and Shubi Abum has likewise given 1,080 pounds of copper, apart from what we had both had written on a sealed tablet to be kept in the temple of Shamash. How have you treated me for that copper? You have withheld my money bag from me in enemy territory. It is now up to you to restore my money to me in full. Take cognizance that from now on I will not accept here any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall from now on select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt. That was long, but I wanted to give you the exact full quote because I think it's extremely interesting, and I think that Nani is being rather patient and has more than enough reason to be upset. To summarize, Ea Nasser, at least to Nani, is selling low quality copper, and not only is he selling a low quality product, but he's promising a high quality product. And when questioned by the servants that are going to pick up the product, he is not nice at all. He's very combative within these transactions. And not only that, he's also refusing to give a full or even partial refund to Nani after his complaint. And Nani has sent multiple messengers to collect a refund. And what does Ea Nasser do? Turns him away empty-handed and sends him through enemy territory to risk the life of the messenger just to add insult to injury for Nani. I don't know about you, but if I was Nani, I would definitely be sending somebody else to E. Nasir's door that wasn't a messenger looking for my money back. But even after all of this, Nani isn't even refusing to deal with E. Nasir anymore. He's just saying that once he gets the copper from E. Nasir, he's going to go through and verify the quality himself before he buys it, which is something he likely should have been doing, but I guess didn't feel like he had to be doing because he was buying from a merchant in the Copper Guild. But lesson learned on Nani's part, check your metal as you buy it. So yeah, this one tablet that was found thousands of years after it was created went on to solidify Ea Nasser as one of the most notorious Bronze Age businessmen and scammers. The Iron Age. The Iron Age is a very interesting time period, and it represents a change of power, at least in the world of metals, as the Iron Age literally represents iron becoming the prominent metal that is being mined, forged, and fashioned into tools and ornaments and armor. And the reason that transition was made is kind of a long story, but the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age was harsh, and humanity as a whole took a step backwards before it could take 2 steps forwards as it transitioned from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. However, the Iron Age is not free from scams, and it itself has a very interesting laundry list of scams that took place, with the one that I'm going to focus on involving silver coinage, debasement, and hyperinflation. Admittedly, the scam I'm about to discuss kind of bleeds out of the Iron Age, but I had other scams I wanted to associate with other time periods, so although this specific scam doesn't take place in the Iron Age, it definitely has its roots in the Iron Age. So I'm going to allow that technicality to make this work, because trust me, we do have some crazy scams coming up. The Iron Age is when we truly see the rise of coinage being used. During the mid to late Iron Age, we see coins being minted and being transacted with, which during this time in history, circa 600 BC, is a relatively new methodology of transacting, because up until this point, all of commerce was conducted through trade, one good for another. There was no store of value. It was simply merchandise for merchandise, no currency of any sort, at least in the form of coinage. Prior to coinage, precious metals were definitely the currency of choice, but they weren't necessarily currency, just something of value to most people, and a good way to store value efficiently, as they were non-perishable and value dense for the most part. Now, even during this time in the late Iron Age, these coins that were being made weren't even used for transacting yet. They were primarily religious objects, typically used as badges or medals. But it didn't take too long for these people that were creating these interesting, valuable medals to create something that had trade value. Specifically with ancient Greek coinage being minted by the Ionian Greeks in the late 6th century, right at the ass crack of the Iron Age. And it is believed that these ancient Greek coins were the first coins ever to be used for transacting on a large-scale basis, and they were made primarily of small silver fractions. But this recent innovation of commerce spread like wildfire through the 5th and 6th century BC, and quickly became the standard, primarily being pioneered by the ancient Greeks and other empires of the time. But this in itself isn't the scam, it's simply the context for the scam that we are about to discuss. This context is important because it anchors us to the Iron Age, although what we're about to discuss happens slightly after the Iron Age, and involves actually the Roman Empire. During the Iron Age, ancient Rome is established, and during the end of the Iron Age, the Roman Republic is established. And during these times, the innovation with iron is giving Rome a lot of strength and a lot of military capability. And due to the rise of ancient Rome and then the Roman Republic, we find ourselves with the Roman Empire, which, like I mentioned, isn't in the Iron Age, but we're making it count. And it's with the Roman Empire that we find ourselves with our very next scam. The scam being coin debasement. And this one scam actually ended up being a contributing factor to the fall of the Roman Empire. By the time that the Roman Empire was established, coinage was in full effect and used effectively, and worked as follows. Early coinage would be made out of pure or near pure materials, typically gold, silver, and copper. These ingots would be purchased, minted, and then sold into circulation with a face value slightly above their metal value. This allowed the government to make a small profit on every coin that they minted, and also allowed the currency to keep a consistent value, as it had an intrinsic value of the metal it was made out of, while it also had a face value of only slightly above that, which everyone generally accepted. Coins typically varied in value from region to region, meaning that in simple modern terms, if you had a coin that had a face value of $2, but was, made out of $1.50's worth of silver, in your region, you can trade this for $2. But if you go to a different region where they have their own coinage, they're not going to accept your coinage at face value, but they'll take it at intrinsic value, meaning that your $2 coin in this new region is now worth $1.50. And this system actually incentivized local trade, as you are going to get the most bang for your buck. But the scam we are going to discuss is the debasement of coin that happened when the government wanted to inflate the number of coins that they could produce, and they tried to do so rather sneakily. There was two primary methods of debasement when they started to use this practice. When the government would mint these coins, they would either make them slightly lighter than they were supposed to be, meaning that they would mint a coin and then shave parts off of it to reclaim small scraps, or they would simply use a poor quality metal. This would save them money and make the coins that they're minting cheaper while they would still be selling them for the same face value, giving the government extra funds. But these methods of debasement continued and began to progress and became more and more severe. What the Roman Empire began to do was start devaluing their coins by not making them a little lighter or using a lower quality material, but actually reducing the percentage of precious metals in the coins. Early coinage of the Roman Empire consisted of anywhere from 93 to 97% of the precious metal they were supposed to be. But it didn't take long for the government to reduce this number from 93% in 107 AD to 78.5% in 193 AD, and then to 35% in 254 AD, and then 20% in 257 AD, and then all the way down until 5% silver in 270 AD. The impact of this was obviously massive, as this massive influx of token supply and massive decline in intrinsic value of these tokens created hyperinflation, and runaway hyperinflation actually happened multiple times throughout the Roman Empire. As I mentioned before, most of this debasement would happen to fund military campaigns to try to get more land, more money, more power, and they likely justified this debasement by saying they were going to collect more wealth for the greater empire. Although what really happened was prices would rise, and the value of coins that everybody was collecting, holding, trading with was dropping significantly. And it wasn't unheard of for an army to go on a campaign, get paid their money, only to realize that once they go to spend their money, the big paycheck that they thought they had gotten is now only worth a few days' meals, which obviously put pressure between the government and the army, something that no government wants to have. I think it's important to note that in modern times, the creation of money and steady inflation is something we kind of just accept, and it's part of how our currency operates. However, at this time, each individual coin had an intrinsic value, and that was the backing of its value. And even if you paid for currency in your local region and took it to a different region, even if they did not accept your region's currency, they would still pay you what your precious metal was worth, meaning that your money could never go to nothing. I suppose to put it in a modern day context, imagine if the government just said, hey, actually it's cheaper to make $1 bills than it is to make $5 bills. So all new $1 bills are actually 5. And the government just wrote a 5 on a $1 bill. You can still see that it's a $1 bill, but you and everyone else is supposed to act like it's a $5 bill. That's gonna create some suspiciousness. And even that, admittedly, is a bad analogy, because the currency that we use today all has the same intrinsic value of nothing, at least not in its physical form. With early coinage in the Iron Age, there was forgery, debasement, and fraud. But I wanted to cover the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire because I thought it was a great summary of what was brewing in the Iron Age at a major historical scale. And while the Roman Empire did not exist in the Iron Age, ancient Rome did. And I'm making this point abundantly clear to prevent any sort of misinformation. And truthfully, the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire was the best example of coin debasement I could find. So I decided to take a story out of the future and apply it to the Iron Age to make this section the best it could be. So yeah, Rome was formed in the Iron Age. Coins were formed in the Iron Age, but likely the most famous example of coin debasement and hyperinflation happened a little after and involved the Roman government literally scamming its people by making the currency cheaper and worse while still maintaining the same face value. And well, it backfired on everybody. The Classical Era. Although we are now in the classical era, the scam that we're about to discuss is anything but classy, and actually contains what is believed to be the first instance of insurance fraud, which is just great to hear that people have been committing insurance fraud for thousands of years. Perhaps insurance fraud is just in our DNA. In the classical era, there was a man in ancient Greece known as Hegestratos, and he was a little bit of a knucklehead. During roughly 5th century BCE, near the beginning of the classical era, maritime trade was booming. Hegestratos was a ship owner and was profiting from this maritime trade that was taken off. And because he had a big and beautiful and shiny ship, he decided that it would be wise to get insurance, which he did. And this insurance not only covered his cargo, but also his ship on any given sea voyage. How it would work is lenders would lend money to these seafarers using the ship and its loot as collateral. The lender would say, hey, your boat is worth 2 gold ingots and everything in it is worth 5 gold ingots. Great, I'll give you 7 gold ingots. If you come back from your journey of trade with 10 ingots worth of stuff, that's great. Give me 9 ingots. That means I make a 2 ingot profit and you make a 1 ingot profit. But if your ship sinks while you're on this voyage, you don't have to give me anything. That's essentially how the insurance existed, and this helped mitigate the risk for the seafarer and also gave these lenders the opportunity to make money with some risk, but obviously nobody was going to be incentivized to sink their own ship or not come back with loot. The whole point of the voyage was to make money, right? That's where Hegestratos comes in. Hegestratos realized that he didn't actually need to go on any adventures at all, and he didn't even need to fill up his boat with loot. What Hegestratos ended up deciding to do was he would fill his ship with things that looked valuable, and what he would typically do was fill crates with sand, cheap ornaments, with sometimes boxes of valuables on top, to make it appear that the whole ship was full of valuables, when in reality there was a layer of valuables on top of a lot of boxes of basically garbage. This would make the ship appear heavy and full, and also give creditors a good reason to give him a good insurance policy. Already, Hegestratos was scamming, because creditors would give Hegestratos an inflated value, essentially. If Hegestratos was able to convince creditors that his boat was worth at least 2 gold ingots, and the contents of his boat were extremely expensive dyes and spices and metals, maybe they would say that the contents of his boat were worth 10 gold ingots, when in reality it was only worth 2 gold ingots when the rest was dirt and sand. That is obviously a scam. But now, sure, Hegestratos has a bunch of gold ingots, but he also has debt, and he's not going to go sail away and make money off of dirt. So what does he do instead? Well, he would go take this boat and deliberately sink it. Now, all of the money that the creditor had given him was his money, fair and straight, and he really was out nothing, and he could continue this plan over and over. And it wasn't long before Hegestratos' scam was exposed. And this kind of shocked the ancient Greek world, because during this time, there was integrity and respect for the law and understanding when it came to commerce. And such a fraud was not even necessarily thought of. But when this scam was exposed, it kind of exposed the vulnerability in these early financial contracts and how people could manipulate things in a way that may seem counterintuitive, but would ultimately be beneficial for the scammer. The case of Hegestratos is considered to be one of the biggest scams of the classical era. Not only because it was just so ballsy, but also because it was the first instance of insurance scam and kind of gave the entire insurance industry a huge shakeup and a wake-up call for how they had to protect themselves moving forward when they were crediting people who could potentially screw them over. So yeah, the classical era, I'm sure, had more scams than you could count, but I definitely think the case of Hegestratos is one of the most interesting and definitely one of the most defining of this time period, the medieval era. I don't know about you, but I feel like the medieval era is definitely one of the most interesting parts of history. You have castles, knights, kingdoms, wealth inequality, and a plethora of scams. What is there not to enjoy? It was honestly a bit tough to pick just one scam for the medieval era, but I'm happy with the one I chose, so let's get right into it. There's no doubt that in medieval times, the Christian religion was everything. And this is kind of proven by all of the art, architecture, writings, everything was the Christian religion. And with every fan base comes collectors. And while the Christian religion didn't necessarily have marketable plushies at the time, they definitely had a huge underground market for relics. And these relics were definitely odd, to say the least. Potentially the most famous Christian relic would be the Holy Grail, but it's definitely not the only relic that people were interested in getting their hands on, with some of the most popular and sought after ancient relics being the literal bones of saints. Like, let's say there was a famous saint who was very prolific and known in the church. Well, once they die, if you could get one of their bones, you could possess their magical powers. Like, literally, that was the mindset. Merchants and other saints and even individuals wanted these bones for a plethora of different reasons. Wealthy individuals would typically want to collect these relics to help make their own desires and dreams come true, as these Christian relics were believed to essentially cause miracles. And in that instance, if there was an object that could bless you, that could make all of your dreams come true, that could protect your family and defeat your enemies, is there really a price you wouldn't pay for them? But here's the thing. Not many people had this money at all. And what people resorted to was visiting churches that had these relics so that they could gain the power and benefit of them from a fraction of the price. And that's exactly why bishops and priests would collect these relics. Obviously, they would see the value of these blessed items that could provide miracles as something that they would want to have in their life and in their church, but they also noticed that any church with a relic was gaining more foot traffic, more donations, and became more or less of a landmark and a hotspot for pilgrimages. And this is where the business opportunity arose. Merchants, whether they believed in the power of these relics or not, if a merchant was able to get their hands on a relic at a decent price, they could sell it to almost anybody with money for an astonishing profit. Here's the issue. As the popularity and demand grew for relics, the supply didn't really. Which was great for investors because, supply and demand, but that also gave incentive for others. The only way that a relic could really even be brought into this underground market was by a crusader who would go and reclaim the relic from the Holy Land, or a merchant who would do business in the Holy Land, hopefully trying to get a relic or something close to a relic that they could buy cheap and sell for a massive profit back in Europe. But these two methods were slow and could not keep up with demand whatsoever, which is why some interesting individuals decided to help contribute to that supply chain issue. Here's the deal. Obviously, these relics have absolutely no certificate of authenticity or receipt or any sort of tracking on where they came from. It's essentially just word of mouth. So if you were a respected or authoritative or even just a charismatic figure, you could kind of pass off anything as a relic with enough convincing. And that's exactly the scam that we are going to discuss. Fake black market Christian relics. Some famous examples of this would be fake bones. For example, Saint John the Baptist was a famous saint that people claimed to have relics of, and these relics were his bones. But once all of the bones that were claimed to be his were accounted for and organized, it was concluded that either Saint John had 3 heads and 5 arms, or some people had some fake relics. 2 other famous and common fake relics were pieces of the Holy Shroud and splinters from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. Obviously, any part of either of these items would have extreme significance to history, and even the tiniest morsel of either of these items would be massively valuable. And for that reason, people decided to make their own. At the time, the only way that these relics could be verified is if they actually had provable miracle abilities. So if a church had a relic in it and somebody with a disability was healed, or a sick person was made healthy again, or a dying person was living longer, or a poor man came into money, if any of these happened after somebody encountered the relic would have been proved real. And the people who had experienced miracles from these relics would go and tell their friends and their family, essentially marketing the church that had this relic in-house. But even with that being said, who's to say if these people had experienced miracles from genuine or non-genuine items? It really kind of gets messy from there. Once the industry of fake relics began to become exposed, it was almost a running joke at the time that if they bought all of the splinters being sold from the cross, they would actually be able to build a warship out of all of the wood. If anybody tries to sell you a piece of wood telling you that it came from the cross that Jesus was crucified on, I would probably pass, or at least confirm it can do miracles before you buy it. The Renaissance era. If you've watched any of my time period videos, you would know that I've actually never covered the Renaissance era by itself, mostly because the time period itself is short and kind of similar to the era that took place before it. One of the most famous figures to come out of the Renaissance era was Michelangelo, likely most famous for his statue of David. But did you know that he got his start by scamming? Circa 1496, Michelangelo sculpted a marble sleeping Cupid. It was an extremely lifelike and beautiful sculpture that highlighted exactly how talented Michelangelo was even at an early age. But during the Renaissance era, art collectors weren't necessarily looking for modern art. They were looking for historic pieces, which typically meant ancient Roman or Greek statues, rather than new ones. So what Michelangelo did with this statue of the Cupid was he decided, instead of selling it for a cheaper price compared to the antiques, he decided to make his new statue an antique by intentionally wearing it down. It's not quite confirmed how he did it, but he made sure to make this sculpture look worn. And it obviously worked because he was actually able to sell it as a lost Roman antiquity. And not only was he able to sell it, but he sold it for a much higher price than he was initially looking for. The sculpture was actually sold to a cardinal, Raphael Riario, who initially was fooled, but eventually discovered the truth. When Cardinal Raphael discovered the truth and confronted Michelangelo, he wasn't upset with him, he was actually impressed, and he invited Michelangelo to Rome. And when Michelangelo came to Rome, he was given his first major opportunity in his career, and this was the actual opportunity that launched Michelangelo's career and made him the icon that he is today. This cardinal was able to understand the genius of the young Michelangelo, and was likely thinking that if he could point him in the right direction, he could create one of the best artists of all time. So yeah, as far as Renaissance scams are concerned, I think Michelangelo selling one of his original artworks as an antiquity summarizes this era perfectly. And it's kind of ironic to think that Michelangelo literally had to make his art something else to try and sell it. Regardless, Michelangelo was dope. But when he was starting out, he was definitely clever when it came to selling his art. The early modern era. We've covered a lot of scams in this video so far, but one scam we haven't covered is the fake king scam. Obviously, because you can't fake being a king, right? There's no way you can just tell people that, hey, actually, I'm the king. Not only are people not going to believe you, but you're likely going to be killed. And that's the truth unless your name was Perkin Warbeck, who in the 1490s not only claimed to be a king, but also became a serious threat for the reigning king at the time. And he gained significant backing and support. But before we get to how this entire scam ends, let me tell you how it starts. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the younger of the two princes in the tower, which, if you're unfamiliar, the princes in the tower refers to a mysterious disappearance of two young royals, King Edward V of England and his younger brother, Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. They were both heirs to the throne of King Edward IV of England, but at the ages of 12 and 9, they were locked away in the Tower of London by their uncle, and they were never seen again. This obviously caused a lot of issues within the kingdom, but for Perkin Warbeck, this created an opportunity. Before pretending to be a king, Warbeck was born into a rich merchant-class family and traveled around and spent time in Ireland selling silks before him and his friend came up with the plan to impersonate the younger of the two brothers who disappeared. As this missing person was not only not found, but was an heir to a throne, meaning that if this person was found, they had legitimate claim to the kingdom, which is definitely a title worth fighting for. Warbeck didn't just necessarily hit the streets telling everybody, hey, by the way, I'm the prince and I'm back and I'm totally good. He was very strategic in who he decided to lay his claim to, which was high-ranking government officials. He gained his first piece of notable support from King Charles VIII of France. And this is a major piece of backing to have behind you. Because if the king of another country recognizes and supports you as the lost heir to a throne, you have some serious credibility to your claim. But this didn't last long. As King Henry VII, the current king, had formed an alliance with the King of France, there was no longer support from the King of France to be helping Perkin Warbeck. So we kind of had to start from scratch once again. So the next place that Perkin Warbeck went for support is actually insane, because he went to the actual sister of the lost princes in the tower, and not only did he go there to claim that he was her long-lost brother, but she bought it up. She was like, oh yeah, you are totally my long-lost brother. And now this support was likely even more valuable than the initial support, because no sibling is going to accept a faker as their long-lost sibling, right? Regardless of their beliefs or intentions, this duchess appeared to believe Perkin Warbeck, and with this support, Perkin continued his conquest to claim that he was the long-lost king. The following year, in 1493, he attended the funeral of Maximilian's father, Frederick III, where he was actually recognized as King Richard IV of England at the funeral. And it only took 2 more years in 1495 for support for Warbeck to have the throne bubbling within England. Warbeck was actually able to gather an army of 150 people and attempted a landing in Kent, where Warbeck and his small army were met with locals who were loyal to their actual king, Henry VII, and the Battle of Deal ensued. Most of this army died, and Warbeck retreated back to Ireland. But even in Ireland, he was facing issues and once again fled to Scotland. While in Scotland, Perkin was actually able to set up an arranged marriage with one of the relatives of the king, known as Lady Catherine Gordon. And now, after officially becoming royalty in some regard, the Scottish palace was open to Warbeck to gather his army and begin to plan another attack on England. The attack that Perkin Warbeck and the Scottish king had planned ended up failing before it even started. And what I mean by that is, before the battle even started, they essentially retreated. But the following year, the Scottish king and Warbeck tried again, but this time their landing was different. In 1497, support for the current king of England was low, primarily to new taxes and rising legislation. And for this reason, and because more time had passed for people to sympathize with Perkin, who was pretending to be the lost king, there was slightly more popularity for him on English soil. So this landing was met with some support. He actually was able to raise a rebellion and was declared King Richard IV, the person he was claiming to be this entire time. And at this point, it may have seemed that his plan was successful, and his next plan of attack was to siege the city, where King Henry VII was currently residing. And this siege failed, and once again, his men died, and Perkin Warbeck had to go into hiding once again. And he was able to flee successfully. Well, at least successfully because he escaped the battle alive, but not fully successfully, because the place that he ended up residing applied a lot of pressure to Perkin. So much pressure so that he actually ended up surrendering himself to the English government, because he was promised a pardon if he surrendered instead of causing any more battles. In 1497, while being tried in front of the real king himself, Perkin Warbeck finally came clean about his elaborate scam and fake life. He told the king that he was not the prince in the tower and he was not royalty whatsoever. He straight up admitted to being a pretender because he was promised immunity for telling the truth. But obviously that wasn't the case. After this admission, he was kept close to the king and essentially imprisoned. And a year later, he actually tried to escape England, where he was caught and brought back, and at that point he was put ironically in the Tower of London, where the initial 2 lost princes were lost from. And it was in here where Perkin Warbeck tried to plan another escape and another overthrowing of the government essentially. That plan was uncovered and Perkin Warbeck was executed in 1499. This was a bit of a longer segment, but I wanted to go into detail because this story is literally insane. In a 9-year span, Perkin Warbeck is going from a rich kid who's just living in Ireland selling silk to, from the suggestion of a friend, dedicating the next 9 years of his life essentially on a conquest to claim that he is the long-lost heir to the throne and trying to overthrow the English king, in which he almost does successfully and ends up admitting everything and then dying because of it. If that's not a scam, I don't know what is. The modern era. Unfortunately, there is absolutely no shortage of scams in the modern day, and I'm sure anybody watching this video right now could name at least 5 to 10 scams just off the top of their head. And that's primarily because of access of information. And at least today, scams are exposed quicker than they would have been at any point in history before. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're exposed quickly enough.